Chapter 1. The Moment of Truth. The dawn light caught the golden prows of 10,000 ships, each one gleaming like a fallen star against the dark waters of Romena's harbour. Ar-Pharazôn the Golden, 25th King of Númenor, stood upon the highest tower of his flagship Alcarondas, and felt the weight of the world pressing down upon his shoulders like a mantle made of lead. This was the moment. Everything had led to this. Behind him stretched the great armament, the mightiest fleet ever assembled by mortal hands. Ships of war filled every bay and inlet from Romena to Andunia, their masts rising like a forest of spears. The morning air thrummed with the sound of 10,000 voices raised in song, crews offering prayers to Eru Ilúvatar for fair winds and swift victory. But Ar-Pharazôn found no comfort in their voices. Instead, the sound grated against something deep in his chest, something that had been growing harder and colder with each passing day. "My king." The voice that spoke behind him was smooth as silk, warm as summer wine, and it made his skin crawl. "The tide turns within the hour. Your captains await the signal to raise anchor." Ar-Pharazôn did not turn around. He could feel Sauron's presence, like heat from a forge, that terrible charisma that had once seemed so reassuring now pressing against his mind like a weight. "I know." "Do you?" There was something different in Sauron's voice now, something sharper. "Because you stand here as though you face a funeral pyre rather than the greatest triumph in the history of mortal men." The king's hands tightened on the tower's stone rail. Below, he could see his soldiers moving like ants across the decks of the warships, making final preparations for the voyage west. West, toward the undying lands. West, toward a confrontation with the Valar themselves. "Tell me again," Ar-Pharazôn said quietly, "how this ends." "My lord?" The surprise in Sauron's voice sounded genuine, but then it always did. The Dark Lord had spent 9 years perfecting that tone, the voice of a wise counselor, genuinely confused by his master's sudden doubt. "Tell me how this ends," Ar-Pharazôn repeated. "We sail west with the greatest armada ever assembled. We land upon the shores of Aman, which no mortal has touched since the world was young. We demand from Manwë and Varda the gift of immortality that they have denied us. And then? Then they cannot refuse you." Sauron moved closer, and Ar-Pharazôn could hear the rustle of rich cloth, could smell the perfume that always surrounded his advisor. Cedar and myrrh and something else, something that reminded him unpleasantly of hot metal. "You will have proven that the might of Númenor surpasses even the power of the Valar. They will grant you the immortality that is rightfully yours, and you will rule not just over Middle-earth, but over all the world. And if they refuse, they will not dare. But if they do?" The silence stretched between them like a taut rope. Ar-Pharazôn could hear the distant sound of trumpets from the harbour below, the creak of rigging as thousands of ships strained against their anchors. When Sauron finally spoke, his voice was different, harder. "Then we will take by force what they will not grant by wisdom." There it was, the truth that had been hiding behind 9 years of honeyed words and careful counsel. Ar-Pharazôn closed his eyes and felt something cold settle in his stomach. War against the Valar. War against the powers that shaped the world. "My grandfather once told me," he said, not opening his eyes, "that there were some doors that should never be opened, some paths that led only to darkness, no matter how bright they appeared at the beginning. Your grandfather was a weak man who let his kingdom stagnate under the shadows of the Eldar." The words hung in the air between them like a blade. Ar-Pharazôn turned around slowly, and for the first time in years, He really looked at the man who had been his closest adviser. Sauron stood there in robes of deep crimson, tall and fair and terrible in his beauty. His face was perfectly composed, but there was something in his eyes now that hadn't been there before. Something hungry and desperate and very, very afraid. "Say that again," Ar-Pharazôn said softly. "I merely meant—" "Say it again." Sauron's perfect composure cracked, just for a moment, just long enough for Ar-Pharazôn to see the truth that had been hiding underneath all these years, the fear, the desperate need, the terrible certainty that his plans were beginning to unravel. "You've been lying to me," the king said. It wasn't a question. "My lord, You've been lying to me for 9 years. Ar-Pharazôn took a step forward, and Sauron actually took a step back. The Dark Lord, stepping back from a mortal man. "You told me the Valar feared Númenor's growing power. You told me they would grant immortality rather than face our wrath. You told me we could win. We can—" "No." The word came out harder than Ar-Pharazôn had intended. "No, we cannot, because that was never the plan, was it? You never expected us to win. You expected us to lose." The mask was falling away now, piece by piece. Sauron's beautiful face twisted with something between rage and terror. "You dare accuse me of— I dare accuse you of exactly what you are," Ar-Pharazôn said, and his voice carried the authority of 25 generations of kings. "A liar, a deceiver, a servant of the shadow who has spent 9 years preparing Númenor for its own destruction." The truth hung between them like a sword. Below, the sounds of preparation continued. Sailors singing, officers shouting orders, the groan of rope and timber, as the great armament prepared to sail toward what they believed would be glory, what Sauron knew would be annihilation. "My lord," Sauron said, and his voice was silk again, smooth and reassuring, but Ar-Pharazôn could see the sweat beading on his brow now, could see the tremor in his hands. "You are overwrought. The burden of command—" "The burden of command," Ar-Pharazôn interrupted, "is to see clearly. And I see you now, Myron who was called Sauron. I see what you are, and what you have tried to make of me." The name hit Sauron like a physical blow. His perfect human guise flickered for just an instant, and Ar-Pharazôn caught a glimpse of something else underneath, something terrible and burning and utterly inhuman. "You know nothing," Sauron snarled, and all pretense of civility was gone now. "Nothing of power, nothing of destiny, nothing of what you could become. I offered you eternity, and you choose to cling to the fears of a dead old man who loved his people more than his pride." Ar-Pharazôn's voice was steady now, calmer than it had been in years. "Who saw through your lies when they were less polished than they are now. Who tried to warn me, and whom I was too proud to hear." He turned back toward the harbor, toward the great armament that waited for his signal. 10,000 ships, 100,000 men, all of them ready to sail into oblivion because their king had listened to the whispers of a liar. "Sound the recall," he said. "What?" "Sound the recall." Ar-Pharazôn's voice carried across the water like thunder. "All ships, stand down. The armament will not sail." For a moment, the only sound was the wind across the water and the distant cry of gulls. Then Sauron laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "You cannot," he said. 9 years of preparation, 9 years of promises to your people, 9 years of building toward this moment, and you think you can simply— "I am the king," Ar-Pharazôn said, and the words carried the weight of all the kings who had come before him. "The fleet is mine, the people are mine, and I will not lead them to destruction for the sake of your lies." He raised his hand, and below in the harbour the horns began to sound, not the triumphant call to battle that the crews expected, but the long, mournful note of recall, the note that meant the great enterprise was finished before it could begin. Sauron's laughter died in his throat. "You fool," he whispered. "You have no idea what you have just done. No idea what you have thrown away." "I know exactly what I have thrown away," Ar-Pharazôn replied, and he turned to face the Dark Lord one final time. "The chance to be remembered as the king who destroyed everything my people built, the chance to be the instrument of Númenor's fall, the chance to do exactly what you wanted me to do from the very beginning." Sauron's beautiful face was twisted with rage now, all pretense finally abandoned. "This changes nothing. Nothing. You think this moment of doubt will save you? Will save any of them? The doom of Númenor was written in the stars before your grandfather drew his first breath. I am merely—" "You are nothing," Ar-Pharazôn said quietly. "You are a servant of lies, who has just lost the only game that mattered to you, and now you will leave my kingdom and never return." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the sounds from the harbour seemed to fade as the two of them stood facing each other, king and deceiver, mortal and Maya, the moment balanced on a knife's edge. Then Sauron smiled. It was a terrible smile, full of rage and malice and something that might have been genuine amusement. "Oh, my lord," he said softly, "you have just made the greatest mistake in the history of your line." And with that, he was gone, not walking away, not disappearing in a flash of light, simply no longer there, as though he had been nothing more than a shadow cast by the morning sun. Ar-Pharazôn stood alone on his tower as the horns continued to sound across the harbour below. In the distance, he could see the crews of his great fleet beginning to lower their battle flags. The great armament, which might have been the most magnificent sight in the history of the world, was being dissolved by his command. He had just saved Númenor from certain destruction. He wondered if anyone would ever thank him for it. Chapter 2. The Unmasking of the Shadow. The first sign that something had gone terribly wrong was the screaming from the Temple of Morgoth. Elendil had been sitting in the hidden chamber beneath his house in Andúnir, listening to the horns of recall echoing across the harbour when the sound reached him. Not the voices of men, but something else entirely. Something that made the very stones of his foundation tremble and the oil in his lamps flicker as though touched by an unseen wind. "Father." Isildur looked up from the ancient scroll he had been copying, his face pale in the lamplight. What was that? Before Elendil could answer, the sound came again, a shriek of rage that seemed to tear through the fabric of the world itself. This time, it was accompanied by a flash of red light that seeped through the cracks in the walls like blood. "Sauron," Elendil whispered, and the name tasted like ashes in his mouth. He had known this day would come. For 9 years, he and the faithful had watched the corruption spread through Númenor like a plague, had seen their friends and neighbours drawn into the worship of the shadow, had witnessed the building of that abomination in Armenelos, where once the greatest temple to Eru Ilúvatar had stood. For 9 years they had waited and prayed, and hoped that somehow, some way, their king would see through the lies. The horns of recall had been their first sign that maybe, just maybe, their prayers had been answered. The inhuman shriek that followed told him the real battle was just beginning. "Gather the others," he said, rising from his chair. "All of them. If the king has finally turned against the deceiver, Sauron will not go quietly." Isildur was already moving, rolling up the scroll with practiced efficiency. "How many can we trust?" "More than you think," Elendil replied, reaching for the sword that had hung unused on his wall for the past 9 years. The faithful have been quiet, but we have not been idle. And if I know anything about the hearts of Númenorians, there are many among the king's men who followed Sauron from fear rather than devotion. Another flash of red light, this one accompanied by the sound of masonry cracking. In the distance, Elendil could hear the clatter of hoofbeats on stone, riders moving fast through the streets of Andunia. "The time of hiding is over," he said, buckling his sword belt around his waist. "For good or ill." In the Temple of Morgoth, what had once been called Sauron's human form writhed in the grip of a fury that threatened to tear it apart from within. The careful mask he had worn for 9 years was gone, burned away by the white-hot rage of seeing his plans crumble to ash in a single moment. The dozen cultists who had been attending him cowered against the walls of the chamber, their faces slack with terror as they watched their lord's beautiful features shift and flow like molten metal. He had grown taller, his limbs elongating in ways that hurt to look at, and his eyes burned with a light that cast no shadows, but somehow made everything darker. "My lord," one of them stammered, "what are your orders?" "Orders?" Sauron's voice was no longer human. It echoed from the walls like the sound of a forge hammer striking red iron. "Orders?" He turned toward the cultist who had spoken, and the man's face went white. 9 years. 9 years of careful work, of whispered words and gentle corruption, of building this miserable island into the perfect instrument of its own destruction. 9 years of patience, and that fool, that proud, stupid fool. The wall beside the cultist exploded outward in a shower of stone and dust. When the debris settled, there was nothing left of the man but a dark stain on the floor. "If Ar-Pharazôn will not be the architect of Númenor's doom," Sauron said, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow filled the entire chamber, "then I will burn it myself, and I will start with him." Ar-Pharazôn was still standing on the tower of his flagship when the red light erupted from the direction of Amenelos. Even at this distance, nearly 10 miles across the water, he could feel the malice in it, could taste the corruption on the wind like smoke from a poisoned fire. "My king!" Captain Hazid came running up the stairs, his face flushed with exertion and fear. "My king, there are reports coming in from the city. I know." Ar-Pharazôn's voice was steady, but his hands were white where they gripped the stone rail. "How many of the men can we trust?" "Sir?" "How many of the men?" the king repeated, turning to face his captain. "Have we lost to the deceiver's lies? How many will stand with Númenor, and how many will stand with the shadow?" Captain Hazid's face went pale as he understood what was being asked. For 9 years no one had spoken such questions aloud. To do so had been treason, but that was before the king himself had named Sauron for what he truly was. Most of the sailors, my lord. The corruption never took root as deeply among the men of the sea. Perhaps 2/3 of the armament remain loyal to you. But the land forces, he swallowed hard. The Temple Guard has been Sauron's from the beginning, and many of the younger nobles have been seduced by his promises of power and glory. 2/3. Ar-Pharazôn nodded grimly. "It will have to be enough. Signal the loyal ships to make for the harbor. We return to Amenelos." "My king, surely it would be safer to what? Hide behind our ships while Sauron tears apart everything our people have built?" Ar-Pharazôn shook his head. "I have spent 9 years running from the truth, Captain. I will not spend another day running from my duty." The Battle of Amenelos began at midday, when the first of Sauron's cultists came pouring out of the temple district like a black tide. They moved with inhuman coordination, their eyes blazing with borrowed fire, and in their hands they carried weapons that had never been forged by Númenorian smiths, blades that drank light and armor, that turned aside steel as though it were parchment. They met Ar-Pharazôn's forces in the great square before the citadel, and for the first hour it seemed as though the corruption might prove too deep to root out. The king's men fought bravely, but they were outnumbered and outmatched. The cultists' weapons cut through their armor like silk, and their inhuman strength sent seasoned warriors flying like broken dolls. But then the faithful came. They emerged from the side streets and hidden places where they had sheltered for 9 years, and they brought with them something the cultists had not expected: weapons blessed in the old way, prayers spoken in the tongue that had been forbidden, and the terrible fury of people who had watched their homeland desecrated and done nothing for far too long. Elendil led them, his ancient sword blazing with a light that made the cultists' dark blades waver and crack. Behind him came men and women who had kept the old faith alive in hidden chambers and secret groves, who had remembered the words of Eru Ilúvatar, even when speaking them meant death. The tide of battle turned. For Númenor, Ar-Pharazôn's voice carried across the square as he led his personal guard into the heart of the fighting. For the true Númenor. The king fought like a man possessed, and perhaps he was, possessed by 9 years of shame and guilt and the desperate need to prove that he was still worthy of his crown. His sword rose and fell in deadly arcs, cutting through the ranks of corrupted cultists, and wherever he went, his men followed. The battle raged for hours, spilling out from the square into the streets and alleys of Armenelos. Houses burned. Ancient buildings that had stood since the founding of the city were reduced to rubble. But slowly, inevitably, the forces of light began to prevail. It was Isildur who struck the killing blow, not against Sauron himself, for the Dark Lord was too cunning to risk his borrowed flesh in direct combat, but against the great altar in the Temple of Morgoth, where the corruption had its deepest root. The young man burst through the temple doors with a dozen companions behind him, and before the remaining cultists could stop him, he brought his sword down on the black stone where so many sacrifices had been offered to the shadow. The altar cracked with a sound like thunder, and the red light that had been bleeding from the temple for hours suddenly went out like a snuffed candle. In the sudden darkness that followed, they heard Sauron scream, not in rage this time, but in genuine anguish, the scream of a spirit being torn from its anchor in the world and hurled back into the void where it belonged. Then there was silence. They found the chamber where Sauron had made his last stand empty, except for a pile of rich robes and the lingering smell of sulphur. The Dark Lord was gone, fled back to Mordor in his spirit form, defeated but not destroyed. It would be years before he could take physical shape again, and when he did, it would be weakened and diminished. But the price of victory had been higher than anyone had imagined. As the sun set over Armenelos, Ar-Pharazôn stood in what had once been the Temple of Morgoth, and looked upon the true scope of the corruption that had taken root in his kingdom. The chamber walls were covered with symbols that hurt to look at, directly, carved deep into the stone and stained with the blood of innocent sacrifices. In the corners, they found the remains of those who had opposed Sauron too openly, too soon. "How many?" he asked quietly. "Too many," Elendil replied. The leader of the faithful stood beside his king, his ancient sword still gleaming with the last traces of the light that had driven back the darkness. Perhaps a third of the island's population was touched by the corruption to some degree. Most can be cleansed, given time and care. But some— He gestured toward a side chamber where they had found the remains of the temple guard. The men had been so thoroughly corrupted that when Sauron's power was broken, they had simply collapsed into dust. Some paid the ultimate price for their choices. Ar-Pharazôn nodded slowly. He was thinking of all the signs he had ignored, all the warnings he had dismissed, all the times he had chosen pride over wisdom and personal ambition over the good of his people. "My lord," Elendil said softly, "what are your orders?" The king was quiet for a long moment, staring up at the ruined ceiling where the stars were beginning to show through the smoke and ash. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute conviction. "Tear it all down," he said. "Every stone of this place, every symbol of the corruption. Let nothing remain to remind future generations that we were once foolish enough to worship the shadow." He turned to face Elendil, and the leader of the faithful saw something in the king's eyes that had not been there for 9 years. Humility. "And then," Ar-Pharazôn continued, "we begin the work of earning the Valar's forgiveness, if such a thing is even possible after what I have allowed to happen here." Outside, the horns were sounding again, not the call to war this time, but the long, mournful notes of mourning for the dead and thanksgiving for the living. The Battle of Armenelos was over. The real work of healing Númenor was just beginning. Chapter 3. The Price of Redemption. The trials began on the 7th day after the Battle of Armenelos, when the smoke had finally cleared from the ruined temple district and the dead had been properly mourned. They held them in the great hall of the citadel, under the carved eagles that had watched over Númenorian justice since the days of Elros himself. Ar-Pharazôn sat upon the throne of his fathers, but he had removed the crown from his head. It lay on a simple table beside him, the star-like gems dim in the morning light that slanted through the tall windows. He would not wear it again, he had declared, until Númenor was truly cleansed. "Bring forward Sigurd the Flame-Tongue," called the herald, using the name that Sauron's most devoted cultist had taken when he renounced his birth name in service to the shadow. The man who stumbled forward in chains barely resembled the proud noble who had once sat at the king's own table. His fine robes had been replaced with rough sackcloth, his carefully groomed beard was matted and wild, and his eyes held the hollow look of someone who had stared too deeply into darkness and found nothing staring back. "You stand accused of treason against the crown, blasphemy against Eru Ilúvatar, and the corruption of innocence in service to the shadow," Ar-Pharazôn said, his voice carrying no warmth, but no cruelty either. "How do you answer?" Sigurd raised his head, and for a moment something flickered in his eyes. Not defiance, but confusion, as though he was struggling to remember who he had been before the corruption took hold. His voice was barely a whisper. "I served my lord faithfully. I did only what he commanded." "Your lord was a liar and a deceiver," said Elendil, who sat at the king's right hand in his capacity as chief among the faithful. "He promised you power and gave you only chains." "He showed me the truth." Sigurd's voice cracked like breaking glass. "He showed me the weakness of the Valar, the lies they told to keep us bound to mortality. He offered us freedom. He offered you slavery," Ar-Pharazôn interrupted, "and you accepted it gladly. But that does not mean you are beyond redemption." The hall fell silent. This was not what anyone had expected to hear from their king's lips. "You will spend the remainder of your natural life in exile," Ar-Pharazôn continued. "You will sail east to Middle-earth with nothing but a ship and supplies for the crossing. There, far from the corruption that claimed you, you may seek to make amends for the evil you have done. If you can find wisdom in solitude that you could not find in power." Sigurd stared at him, tears streaming down his cheeks. "My lord, Why? Because, the king said quietly, I too was corrupted. I too listened to the whispers of the shadow and called them wisdom. The difference between us is not that I was stronger, but that I was luckier. I had friends wise enough to remember the truth when I had forgotten it. The destruction of the Temple of Morgoth took 3 weeks. They could not simply tear it down. The corruption had seeped too deeply into the stone itself, had twisted the very foundations until they pulsed with a malevolent life of their own. Instead, they had to dismantle it piece by piece, blessing each stone as it was removed and purifying the ground beneath with water from the sacred spring of Meneltarma. Isildur worked alongside the labourers, his young face grim with determination, as he helped carry away the defiled altars and broken idols. He said little, but Elendil could see the weight of what they were uncovering, the full scope of the atrocities that had been committed in that cursed place, pressing down upon his shoulders. This is what evil looks like when it is given free rein, Elendil said, pausing in his own work to stand beside his son. Remember this. Remember how easily good men can be led to do terrible things when they stop asking whether they should do something and ask only whether they can. Isildur nodded, wiping sweat from his brow with a cloth that came away stained with ash and worse things. Will it ever be clean again? This place? In time. Elendil looked toward the center of the demolished temple, where the great altar had stood. Already, green shoots were beginning to push up through the sanctified soil. Not the twisted growths that had flourished under Sauron's influence, but honest grass and wild flowers. The earth remembers what it was before the corruption came. It will remember again. They worked until sunset, and when the last stone had been carried away and blessed, they planted an oak sapling in the center of the cleared ground. It was small and fragile, barely more than a stick with a few leaves, but it would grow. In time, it would become a great tree whose branches would shade a new generation of Númenorians who had never known the shadow's touch. Ar-Pharazôn made his pilgrimage to Meneltarma on foot, walking the ancient path that wound up the sacred mountain as his ancestors had done for 2,500 years. He wore no crown, carried no symbol of his rank, bore no weapon save a simple walking stick cut from mountain ash. Behind him walked a small company of the faithful, volunteers who had asked to share in whatever judgment the Valar might render upon their king. The climb took 3 days. 3 days of walking through increasingly thin air, past markers that recorded the visits of 24 kings before him, each seeking the blessing of the powers that had given Númenor its glory. But none of them had come as Ar-Pharazôn came, not as a conqueror seeking divine sanction for his ambitions, but as a penitent seeking forgiveness for his crimes. On the 3rd day, they reached the hollow of Eru at the mountain's peak. It was a simple place, a circle of white stones surrounding a flat altar where no fire was ever kindled and no sacrifice was ever offered, for Eru Ilúvatar had need of neither. Here, the first kings of Númenor had come to give thanks for the gift of their island home. Here, Tar-Palantir had made his last desperate prayers for the salvation of his people. Here, Ar-Pharazôn knelt and spoke the words that had been building in his heart since the moment he chose to turn away from Sauron's lies. Eru Ilúvatar, he said, his voice barely audible in the thin mountain air. Lord of all, I have sinned. I have led your people into darkness and called it light. I have listened to the whispers of your enemy and named them wisdom. I have turned away from the gift you gave us and sought to take by force what was never mine to claim. The wind that swept across the mountaintop was cold and sharp, carrying with it the smell of snow from the peaks beyond. It tugged at his hair and clothes and for a moment he thought he could hear voices in it. Not the voice of Sauron, which had always been warm and seductive and easy to hear, but something else. Something older and deeper and infinitely more patient. "I do not ask for forgiveness," he continued, "for I know that some sins are too great to be simply pardoned. But I ask for the chance to make amends. I ask for wisdom to see the path that leads away from darkness, and I ask for the strength to walk it, no matter how hard or lonely it may prove to be." The silence that followed seemed to stretch for an eternity. The sun was setting behind the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, and Ar-Pharazôn found himself thinking of the great armament that he had built to sail toward those same peaks. 10,000 ships that would have carried 100,000 men to their doom, if not for a moment of clarity that had come almost too late. Then the eagle came. It appeared out of the gathering dusk, a magnificent bird larger than any that had ever been seen in the skies above Númenor. Its feathers shone like burnished gold in the last light of the sun, and its eyes held depths that spoke of wisdom older than the world. It circled the Hallow 3 times, its great wings casting shadows across the white stones, and then it settled on the altar itself. For a long moment, man and bird regarded each other in perfect silence. Then the eagle opened its beak and sang, not the harsh cry that most birds of prey make, but a sound of pure beauty that seemed to echo off the mountain peaks and rise toward the first stars that were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. When the song ended, the eagle spread its wings and took flight once more, disappearing into the night as suddenly as it had come. "The Valar have heard," whispered one of the faithful who had witnessed the visitation. "They have heard, and they do not reject us." Ar-Pharazôn remained kneeling until the stars came out in their full glory, and when he finally rose, he felt lighter than he had in years. Not forgiven, not yet, perhaps not ever, but accepted. The path to redemption was open, if he had the courage to walk it. The great debate took place in the Hall of the Kings, 3 weeks after the king's return from Meneltarma. Representatives came from every corner of the island. Nobles and merchants, farmers and fishermen, craftsmen and scholars. Even some of those who had been exiled for their corruption were permitted to send letters stating their views. For this decision would affect not just Númenor, but all the free peoples of Middle-earth. The question before them was simple to state and impossibly complex to answer. What should Númenor do now? "We have spent 9 years building an army," argued Lord Verondil of Forrestar, one of the few nobles who had managed to resist Sauron's influence entirely. "The greatest fleet ever assembled, trained soldiers beyond counting, weapons and supplies enough to wage war across all Middle-earth. Are we to simply disband all of this and hope that Sauron will be content to leave us in peace?" "The army was built for conquest," replied Lady Mithrellas, speaking for the guilds of Andunia. "It was meant to be the instrument of our pride, not our protection. Perhaps we should indeed disband it and focus on rebuilding what we have lost." "And what of the people of Middle-earth?" The voice that spoke was young, but clear, and all heads turned toward Isildur as he rose from his seat among the lesser nobles. "What of the men of Gondor and Arnor, who look to Númenor as their elder brother? What of the elves of Lindon, who have fought against the shadow since the world was young? Are we to abandon them to Sauron's mercy while we tend our own gardens?" Murmurs rippled through the hall. The boy spoke boldly for one so young, but there was wisdom in his words. "The lad speaks truly," said a gruff voice from the back of the hall. Captain Hazid of the Royal Navy stood and addressed the assembly, his weathered face serious. Sauron may have lost his hold on Númenor, but he still has Mordor. He still has his 9 servants, his armies of orcs, his alliance with the dark men of the south. If we do nothing, he will rebuild his strength and threaten us again in time. But if we act, countered Lady Mithrellis, are we not risking the very pride that led us astray in the first place? Are we not assuming that it is our place to be the saviors of Middle-earth? The debate raged for hours, with passionate speeches on both sides. Some argued for isolation, for focusing entirely on healing the wounds that Sauron had inflicted upon their island home. Others called for immediate action, for striking at the Dark Lord while he was weakened and scattered. It was Elendil who finally brought clarity to the chaos. The tall lord rose slowly from his seat at the king's right hand, and something in his bearing commanded instant attention. Perhaps it was the memory of how he had led the faithful out of hiding to fight beside their king. Perhaps it was the respect he had earned through years of quiet courage and unwavering faith. Or perhaps it was simply the weight of the words he spoke. "My friends," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the great hall, "I have lived through the glory days of Númenor, and I have lived through its darkest hour. I have seen what we are capable of when we act from wisdom, and I have seen what we become when we act from pride. And I say to you now that there is a difference between thinking ourselves the masters of Middle-earth and acknowledging our responsibility to defend it." He paused, letting his words sink in, then continued. "Númenor was given to us as a gift, but it was not given to us alone. We are the children of those who stood against the darkness in the elder days. Our ancestors bled and died so that the light might not go out of the world. We inherited their courage, their strength, and their burden. That burden is to stand guard against the shadow wherever it may rise." Another pause. The hall was completely silent now. "But we must not stand as conquerors. We must stand as guardians, not as kings of Middle-earth, but as its servants, not demanding tribute, but offering aid, not seeking glory, but seeking justice." He looked around the hall, meeting the eyes of nobles and commoners alike. "Sauron counted on our pride to destroy us. He whispered that we deserved dominion over all the world, and we listened. But perhaps our true strength lies not in dominion, but in service. Perhaps the greatest victory we can win over the shadow is to prove that power can be used selflessly." When Elendil sat down, the hall remained silent for a long moment. Then, slowly, one by one, the representatives began to stand. Not to speak, but simply to show their agreement. Even those who had argued most passionately for isolation found themselves nodding as they considered his words. Ar-Pharazôn looked out over the assembly and saw in their faces the same thing he had felt on the mountain peak. Not the arrogance that had nearly destroyed them, but the quiet determination that had built their kingdom in the first place. "Then it is decided," he said, his voice carrying the authority of all the kings who had come before him. "We will go to war, not as conquerors but as defenders, not for glory but for justice. And we will remember, in every decision we make and every action we take, that our strength is not our own, but a gift from the one who rules over all." The cheers that followed were not the wild roars of a mob drunk on the prospect of conquest, but something deeper and more lasting, the sound of a people who had found their way back to themselves after years of wandering in darkness. Outside, the eagle that had visited the mountain peak circled once more above the citadel, its golden feathers catching the last light of day, before disappearing into the west. The real work was about to begin. Chapter 4. The second great armament. The sound of hammers on anvils rang across the harbour of Ravenna from dawn to dusk. But it was different now. Where once the smiths had worked with feverish haste, driven by pride and conquest, lust, now they laboured with the steady rhythm of craftsmen who understood the sacred nature of their task. Each blow of the hammer was struck with prayer, each piece of iron shaped with reverence for the purpose it would serve. Master Telchion wiped the sweat from his brow as he examined the prow piece he had been forging for the past 3 days. The design was the same as those that had adorned the ships of the first great armament, the eagle of Manwë, with wings spread wide. But the execution was entirely different. Where the original eagles had been wrought with arrogant defiance, these were shaped with humility. Where the first had seemed to challenge the very heavens, these appeared to be seeking benediction. "It is good work," said a voice behind him. Telchion turned to see King Ar-Pharazôn standing in the doorway of his forge, but it took him a moment to recognize his sovereign. The king wore simple working clothes and had rolled up his sleeves, revealing arms already darkened with soot from other forges he had visited that morning. The crown was nowhere to be seen. "My lord," Telchion said, hastily setting down his hammer and attempting to bow, but Ar-Pharazôn waved him back to his work. "I came to see how the ships progress," the king said, moving closer to examine the prow-piece, "and to work alongside my people, if you will have me." The master smith stared at him. In 9 years of Sauron's influence, the king had never once set foot in the Forge District except to issue commands. Now he stood there, asking permission to work like a common labourer. "Aye, of course, my lord. But surely you have greater duties." "No duty is greater than ensuring these ships are built with the right spirit," Ar-Pharazôn replied, taking up a smaller hammer from the tool rack. "In my pride, I built the first armament to carry us to our doom. Now, in whatever wisdom I can muster, I will help build the second to carry us toward redemption." They worked side by side in comfortable silence, the king and the craftsman, shaping metal with the same careful attention to detail. And word of it spread through the harbour like wildfire. The king himself was labouring alongside his people, not commanding from on high, but serving from below. By evening, the other forge masters had arrived to see for themselves. By the end of the week, nobles who had never lifted anything heavier than a wine cup were learning to work leather and rope. Ladies of the court were stitching sails with the same delicate fingers that had once embroidered silk gowns. The second great armament was being built not by subjects serving their king, but by a people united in common purpose. "Again," commanded Captain Valandel, his voice carrying across the training ground without strain, despite the fact that he had been drilling his men since before dawn. "Remember, you are not fighting for conquest. You fight for protection, not to take, but to defend. Let that purpose guide your sword." The men of his company, half king's men, half faithful, all volunteers, reformed their line and charged again. Their technique was flawless, honed by years of training, but Valandel could see something more in their movements now, a steadiness that had been missing before, a sense of fighting for something larger than themselves. At the edge of the practice field, Isildur worked with a group of younger recruits, teaching them the sword forms that his father had taught him. The young man had proven himself a natural leader in the months since the Battle of Armenelos, and many of the former cultists who had been granted amnesty looked to him as a symbol of redemption. "The sword serves the hand, and the hand serves the heart," Isildur was saying, demonstrating a defensive parry. "If your heart is pure, your hand will be steady, and your sword will find its mark." One of the recruits, a former temple guard named Castamir, who still bore the scars of his corruption, struggled with the form. His movements were powerful, but wild, driven more by anger than purpose. "I cannot forget," Castamere said through gritted teeth as he attempted the parry again, and failed. "I cannot forget what I did, what I became. The rage burns in me still." Isildur lowered his practice sword and studied the older man with eyes that held wisdom beyond his years. "The rage is not your enemy," he said quietly. "What you did under Sauron's influence was not truly you. It was the shadow of you, twisted and corrupted. But the rage you feel at what was done, that is yours. That is clean. Use it. Use it how? To ensure it never happens again. To anyone." Castamere stared at him for a long moment, then raised his sword again. This time, when he attempted the parry, it was perfect. Controlled fury, channeled into precise motion. Watching from the command pavilion, Elendil nodded approvingly. His son understood something that many veteran warriors never learned, that the best soldiers were not those who fought without feeling, but those who fought with the right feelings. "He will make a fine captain," said a voice beside him. Elendil turned to see Lady Inzelbeth approaching, the king's cousin, and one of the few nobles who had openly opposed Sauron even in the darkest days. She wore practical riding clothes rather than court dress, and her hands bore the calluses of someone who had been working alongside the common soldiers. "He is still young," Elendil replied. "But yes, I believe he will." "Young enough to see clearly," she said, watching as Isildur continued to work with the former cultists. "Old enough to act wisely. That is a rare combination in any age." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the transformation taking place across the training grounds. Men who had been enemies months before now fought side by side. Former cultists took instruction from the faithful without resentment. King's men, who had once looked down upon the religious devotion of their neighbors, now found themselves praying alongside them before practice. "Do you think it will be enough?" Lady Inzelbeth asked eventually. "Can we truly defeat Sauron when we couldn't even see through his lies?" "We were deceived because we wanted to be," Elendil replied. "We listened to his promises because they told us what we wished to hear. But Sauron made a mistake when he came to Númenor in person. He showed us his true nature, and now we can never unsee it." He gestured toward the training grounds, where hundreds of men were learning to fight as a unified force. "These men are not fighting because they believe they are destined to rule Middle-earth. They fight because they believe they are called to protect it. That makes them infinitely more dangerous than anything Sauron has faced before." The ship that arrived from Lindon on the first day of spring flew no banner and bore no identifying marks, but the tall figure who disembarked at the private wharf below the citadel could only be one of the Eldar. He moved with the unconscious grace that marked his kind, and his eyes held depths that spoke of ages beyond mortal counting. Círdan the shipwright had come to answer Númenor's call for alliance. Ar-Pharazôn met him at the harbour personally, wearing simple robes of blue and silver with the star-shaped brooch of his house as his only symbol of rank. Behind him came Elendil and a small escort, but no formal court procession. This was diplomacy of a different kind than Númenor had practiced in recent years. "Lord Círdan," the king said, offering a bow of genuine respect, "you honor us with your presence." The elf lord studied him for a long moment before responding, and Ar-Pharazôn found himself holding his breath. Everything depended on this moment, on whether the elves could see past what Númenor had become under Sauron's influence to what it might become again. "You have changed, King of Númenor," Círdan said at last. "When last we met, you stood taller and spoke louder. yet somehow you seem more kingly now." "I have learned the difference between ruling and serving," Ar-Pharazôn replied, "between commanding and leading, between taking counsel and accepting wisdom." Círdan nodded slowly. "Gil-galad sends his regards and his cautious hope. The news of Sauron's expulsion from your realm reached Lindon with the spring winds. But news and truth are not always the same thing. We needed to see for ourselves what manner of king now sits upon the throne of Númenor." "And what do you see?" "I see a man who has walked through fire and been purified by it," the elf lord replied. "I see armies that train not for conquest but for protection. I see ships being built with prayers rather than curses." He paused, his ancient eyes meeting the king's mortal ones. "I see hope where I expected to find only pride and ambition." The formal negotiations took place in the Hall of the Kings, but they were unlike any diplomatic proceedings in Númenor's history. Rather than demands and counter-demands, there were shared concerns. Rather than bargaining for advantage, there was planning for mutual protection. "Sauron's spirit has returned to Mordor," Círdan reported, his voice grave. "Already he begins to rebuild his strength. The 9 who served him have scattered to the corners of Middle-earth, but they will not remain hidden long. And there are rumors from the south. The Haradrim grow restless, and ships bearing black sails have been seen off the coasts of Far Harad." "How long do we have?" Ar-Pharazôn asked. "Years, perhaps, but not many. Sauron is weakened by his defeat here, but he is not destroyed, and he will not make the mistake of subtle corruption again. When next he strikes, it will be with open war." "Then we must be ready to meet him," Elendil said. "Not as separate peoples fighting separate battles, but as allies united in common cause." Círdan smiled, the first true smile he had shown since arriving. "Gil-galad hoped you would say such words. He sends word that the harbours of Lindon are open to Númenorian ships, and the forges of Ostin Edhill are prepared to work alongside your smiths. If you will have us as partners rather than vassals, the Eldar will stand with Númenor against the shadow." The treaty they signed that day was inscribed not on gold or silver, but on simple parchment, with ink made from oak gall and spring water. It spoke not of tribute or dominion, but of friendship and mutual aid. And when it was done, Ar-Pharazôn felt a weight lift from his shoulders that he had not even known he was carrying. For the first time in 9 years, Númenor was no longer alone. The envoys who returned from the secret negotiations with the dwarves of Khazad-dûm bore news that was both encouraging and sobering. Lord Durin, king under the mountain, had agreed to provide weapons and supplies for the coming war, but his price was not gold or silver. "He asks for a promise," reported Captain Anarion, Elendil's younger son, who had led the mission through the treacherous mountain passes to the great dwarf realm. "A promise that when Sauron is defeated, not if, but when, Númenor will not seek to claim dominion over the dwarves or their works." "That is all?" Ar-Pharazôn asked, puzzled. "No payment? No tribute?" "Durin said that the promise was worth more than all the gold in his treasury," Anarion replied. "He remembers the days when Númenor first came to Middle-earth as teachers and friends, not conquerors. He wishes to see those days return." The king was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window toward the harbour, where the second great armament was taking shape. Then he laughed, not the bitter laughter of defeat, but the warm laughter of recognition. "The dwarves understand something we had forgotten," he said, "that the greatest treasure a king can possess is the trust of his allies. Very well, we will give Lord Durin his promise, and gladly. Let it be recorded in the treaties. Númenor claims no dominion over the free peoples of Middle-earth, only the right to stand alongside them as friends. The blessing of the fleet took place at sunset on the summer solstice, when the light lasted longest and the darkness held the least power. Every ship was consecrated individually, with water from Meneltama and words spoken in the ancient tongue that had been used before Sauron's corruption spread through the island. The priests who performed the ceremony were volunteers from among the faithful, men and women who had kept the old ways alive in hidden places while the Temple of Morgoth cast its shadow over the land. Now they stood in the open air under the eyes of the Vala, offering prayers that had not been heard in public for nearly a decade. Ar-Pharazôn stood at the prow of his new flagship, not the Alcarondas, which had been built for conquest, but the Tar-Kalion, named not for himself, but for the light of hope that burns even in the darkest hour. The ship was smaller than his previous vessel, built for speed and endurance rather than intimidation, and its eagle figurehead looked west with longing rather than challenge. "Eru Ilúvatar," the king spoke, his voice carrying across the harbour to every ship and every man. "We commit these vessels to your service and the protection of your children. May they carry us safely to where we are needed, and may they bring us home again when our work is done. Not for our glory, but for yours. Not for our triumph, but for the triumph of all that is good and true." The response that came back from 10,000 throats was not the war cry he had once commanded, but something deeper and more powerful. "Eru Ilúvatar, let it be so." As the blessing concluded, 3 more ships appeared on the horizon, swift vessels bearing the banner of Gil-galad, the High King. The elven envoys had arrived to accompany the armament to Middle-earth as proof of the alliance that would change the fate of all free peoples. The second great armament was ready to sail, and this time it would carry hope instead of hubris, protection instead of conquest, service instead of dominion. The tide turned at midnight, and with it the course of the war against the shadow. Chapter 5. The landing at Umbar. The harbour of Umbar had been beautiful once. Ar-Pharazôn remembered it from his youth, when Númenorian traders had sailed these waters freely, and the great port city had been a bridge between the northern kingdoms and the exotic realms of the south. White towers had risen from the headlands, their walls carved with the intricate geometric patterns that the Southrons favoured, and the harbour itself had been filled with ships of every design. Swift Númenorian vessels alongside the distinctive triangular sails of Haradrim merchants and the sturdy craft of the coastal dwellers. Now, as he stood on the deck of the Tar-Kalion and watched the sun rise over what had once been the pearl of the south, he could barely recognize the place. The white towers had been torn down and replaced with crude fortifications of black stone. Where once graceful minarets had reached toward the sky, now jagged spires rose like broken teeth, each one topped with banners that bore the red eye of Mordor. The harbour waters, which had once been clear enough to see the bottom 20 fathoms down, now ran dark with silt and worse things. "How many years has it been since Sauron's influence reached this far south?" asked Lord Círdan, who stood beside the king at the ship's rail. The elf lord's ancient eyes were troubled as they took in the corruption that had transformed the once beautiful city. "Too many," Ar-Pharazôn replied grimly. "We should have acted sooner. We should have seen what was happening and done something to stop it." "You were not yet king when this began," Círdan pointed out gently. "And when you did take the crown, you had other concerns closer to home." That was true enough, but it brought no comfort. Ar-Pharazôn could see the results of his people's long isolation, written in the defiled stones of Umbar's walls. While Númenor had turned inward, consumed by its own pride and corruption, Sauron had been spreading his influence across the southern reaches of Middle-earth like a plague. "Signal the fleet," he said, turning away from the sight. "We land at dawn." The assault on Umbar began before the sun had fully cleared the horizon, but it was unlike any attack in the military history of Númenor, where once their ships would have sailed into harbour with flags flying and trumpets blaring, announcing their presence and demanding submission. The second great armament approached with careful stealth. The first wave consisted of swift scout vessels that landed on the beaches north and south of the main harbour, their crews moving like shadows to secure the landing zones. Captain Valandil led the northern assault, his men moving through the pre-dawn darkness with the efficiency born of months of training. They had practiced this landing a dozen times on the beaches of Númenor, working through every possible complication, every potential obstacle. But as they pulled their boats up onto the dark sand and began to advance toward the first line of fortifications, they encountered something they had not prepared for. "Captain," whispered Sergeant Thorondor, his voice tight with disbelief, "you need to see this." Valandil low-crawled through the beach grass until he reached the position where his scout was waiting. What he saw there made his stomach turn. The first line of defense was not made of stone or timber, but of people. Dozens of civilians, men, women, and children from the surrounding countryside, had been chained to wooden stakes, driven into the sand. They were alive, but barely, their eyes glazed with the effects of some drug or sorcery. And behind them, barely visible in the darkness, armed Suthrons waited with weapons ready. "They mean us to kill innocents to reach our enemies," Valandil breathed. It was brilliant in its cruelty. The old Númenor, the Númenor of pride and conquest, would have charged through the human shields without hesitation, counting the civilian deaths as acceptable losses in pursuit of victory. But that was not what the second great armament had been built for. Valandil made his decision without consulting his superiors. "Signal the other companies," he ordered quietly. "We advance on foot, but we do not engage until every civilian is safely behind our lines." It took 3 hours instead of 30 minutes, but when the sun rose fully, every one of the chained prisoners had been freed and evacuated to safety. Only then did the Númenorians advance against the Southron positions. The fighting that followed was fierce but brief. The corrupted garrison of Umbar fought with desperate courage, but they were no match for disciplined troops who knew what they were fighting for. By midday, the northern beaches were secure. The southern assault, led by Isildur, had encountered similar tactics and responded in similar fashion. Word of the Númenorians' refusal to sacrifice innocents spread through the city like wildfire, and by evening, civilians were beginning to slip away from the Southron positions to seek protection behind the lines of the invaders. The assault on the harbour itself presented a different challenge altogether. The Southrons had had years to prepare their defences, and they had used the time well. The harbour mouth was blocked by a massive chain stretched between 2 fortified towers, each one crowned with catapults that could sink any ship that tried to force the passage. Behind the chain, war galleys waited in neat formation, their oars ready to drive them forward the moment the Númenorian fleet came within range. Standing on the highest tower, clearly visible to anyone with a spyglass, was a figure that made Elendel's blood run cold. The Nazgul wore the black robes and iron crown of a king of old, but the darkness that surrounded him was palpable even at this distance. One of the 9, come to oversee the defense of Sauron's most important southern stronghold. "We could try to force the passage," suggested Admiral Siriaton, studying the defenses through his own glass. "The Númenor has ram enough to break that chain, and our marines are more than a match for anything the Southrons can put afloat." "At what cost?" Ar-Pharazôn asked. "How many ships would we lose? How many men?" "Hard to say, my lord. Perhaps a third of the fleet. Maybe more if the Nazgul has powers we haven't accounted for." Ar-Pharazôn was quiet for a long moment, watching the dark figure on the distant tower. A third of the fleet. Thousands of lives, all to take a single harbor, however important it might be. "There has to be another way," he said finally. It was Anarion who found it. Elendil's younger son had been studying the harbor charts that Círdan had brought from the ancient archives of Lindon, comparing them to the current coastline. The Southrons had been so focused on defending the main harbor that they had ignored the old smugglers' channels that ran through the salt marshes east of the city. "Here," he said, pointing to a thin blue line on the centuries-old map. "The Tarlang Channel. It's too shallow for warships, but boats could get through. A few hundred men could land behind their lines and take the tower from the rear, while the fleet creates a distraction in front." Isildur leaned over the chart, his finger tracing the winding waterway. "It would be dangerous. If they discover us in the marshes, we'd be trapped with nowhere to run." "I'll lead it myself," Anarion said quietly. "No." The voice that spoke was Elendil's, but it carried the absolute authority of a man who would not be argued with. "I will lead it. You and your brother will stay with the main fleet." "Father." "This is not open for debate." Elendil's tone softened slightly. "You found the path, Anarion, and it is a good one. But I will not send my sons into danger while I remain safe aboard ship. That is not the kind of leader I intend to be." Ar-Pharazôn watched the exchange with something approaching envy. How long had it been since anyone in his family had spoken to him with such mix of love and respect? How long since he had earned that kind of trust? "The plan is sound," he said. "Lord Elendil will lead the marsh assault with 500 volunteers. The rest of us will begin the frontal attack at dawn. With luck, we can take both towers simultaneously and break their defenses without excessive loss of life." The Battle of Umbar Harbour began with the sound of war horns echoing across the water, but the real fight took place in silence. While the main fleet advanced toward the harbour mouth in full view of the defenders, drawing their attention and their fire, Elendil and his volunteers were threading their way through the treacherous channels of the Tarlang Marsh. The water was barely deep enough for their shallow draft boats, and more than once they had to get out and drag their craft over hidden sandbars. The marsh itself was a nightmarish place. The water was black and stagnant, choked with weeds that seemed to writhe with unnatural life. Strange lights flickered in the distance, and once they heard what sounded like voices calling for help. But when they investigated, they found only empty reeds and the lingering smell of decay. "Sauron's influence has touched even this place," murmured one of the faithful who served as Elendil's guide. "The very water reeks of corruption." "All the more reason to cleanse it," Elendil replied, but his hand never left the hilt of his sword. They reached the eastern shore of the harbour just as the main battle began. From their position in the reeds, they could see the Númenorian fleet advancing in perfect formation, their ships' catapults returning fire against the shore batteries. The Southron war galleys had emerged to meet them, and the water between the opposing forces was soon filled with the crash of timber and the screams of wounded men. But Elendil's attention was focused on the eastern tower, now only 100 yards away. He could see the Nazgul standing at its peak, arms raised as if conducting some dark ritual. Whatever sorcery the creature was working, it was having an effect. Several Númenorian ships had already turned away from the battle, their crews apparently overcome by supernatural fear. "Remember," Elendil whispered to his men as they prepared to leave the boats, "the creature up there feeds on fear and despair. Think of home. Think of the people you're protecting. Think of anything except the darkness it represents. The assault on the tower was swift and brutal. The Southron garrison, focused on the naval battle raging in the harbour, never saw the attack coming. Elendil's men swept through the lower levels like a tide, their swords cutting down any who stood in their way. But as they climbed the tower's spiral staircase, the temperature began to drop. Ice formed on their weapons and armour, and their breath misted in the suddenly frigid air. The Nazgul had become aware of their presence. Elendil reached the top of the tower, just as the creature turned to face him. At close range, the horror of it was almost overwhelming. The empty space, where its face should have been. The cold that radiated from its form like winter given shape. The voice that spoke without words directly into his mind. "You are too late, son of kings. My lord's servants already march from Harad and Khand. Soon, all the south will kneel before the shadow." "Perhaps," Elendil replied, raising his sword. The ancient blade, forged in the elder days and blessed by the light of the two trees, blazed with silver fire. But not today. The battle that followed was brief but terrible. The Nazgul fought with powers that mortal steel could not normally touch, but Elendil's sword was no ordinary weapon. Each blow it struck drove the creature back. Each parry turned aside claws of shadow and frost. In the end, it was not Elendil's skill that won the day, but his faith. As the Nazgul lunged forward for what might have been the killing blow, the Lord of Andunia spoke a single word, the true name of Eru Ilúvatar, the one who stood above all the Valar and all their servants. The effect was instantaneous. The Nazgul shrieked, a sound like breaking glass and winter wind, and dissolved into mist. It was not destroyed, for such creatures could not be truly killed while their master lived, but it was banished, driven back to the shadows from which it had come. Below in the harbour, the Southron fleet saw their commander's tower fall and their supernatural protector flee. Their courage broke, and what had been an organized defense became a rout. Ship after ship struck its colors or turned to flee toward the open sea. By sunset, the harbor of Umbar belonged to Númenor once again. The city that the Númenorians occupied was not the Umbar they remembered. Years of Sauron's influence had twisted more than just the architecture. The population was sullen and fearful, quick to cringe at the sight of armed men, slow to trust the promises of liberation. Many of the buildings showed signs of hasty conversion to the worship of darkness, altars stained with substances best not examined too closely, walls carved with symbols that hurt to look at directly. But perhaps worst of all were the children. They moved like ghosts through the streets, their eyes old beyond their years, their voices never rising above whispers. Whatever the Southrons had done to them under Sauron's direction, it had broken something essential in their spirits. "It will take years to undo this damage," said Lady Inzelbeth, who had come ashore with the second wave to help establish order in the conquered city. "Perhaps generations." "Then we will take years," Ar-Pharazôn replied. He stood in what had once been the main temple of the city, now slowly being cleansed of the corruption that had defiled it. "However long it takes." They established their base of operations in the old harbour master's palace, a sprawling complex that overlooked both the sea and the land approaches to the city. From here, they could coordinate with Gil-galad's forces in the north, while keeping watch on the roads that led south toward the lands that remained under Sauron's control. The intelligence that began to flow in was both encouraging and sobering. Encouraging because news of Númenor's unexpected return had spread faster than their ships, causing panic in Sauron's southern domains, and forcing him to recall troops that had been marching toward other targets. Sobering because it revealed just how far the corruption had spread and how much work remained to be done. "He never expected us to return," reported one of the local merchants, who had offered his services as a guide and interpreter. The man's name was Azrahil, and though he had collaborated with the occupying forces, he seemed genuinely relieved by their departure. The Dark Lord's servants spoke often of the great fleet that had been assembled to attack the Undying Lands. They believed you would all be dead by now, drowned beneath the waves by the wrath of the Valar. And instead, we have returned to drive them from our ancient holdings, Isildur said with satisfaction. I wonder what other surprises we might have in store for them. Ar-Pharazôn said nothing, but his thoughts were already turning northward, toward the dark land of Mordor, where Sauron himself crouched like a spider in his tower. The taking of Umbar was only the beginning. The real war lay ahead, and it would require all their strength, all their courage, and all their newly found wisdom to see it through to the end. But for the first time since the horns of recall had sounded in Romena's harbour, the king allowed himself to hope that they might actually win. Chapter 6. The Road to Mordor. The roads of Horondor had once been the pride of the southern kingdoms, wide highways paved with white stone that gleamed in the desert sun, lined with shade trees and marked with way stations where travelers could find water and rest. Now they were arteries of misery, choked with the traffic of slavery and despair. Isildur crested the low ridge that overlooked the great south road and felt his stomach turn at the sight below. A caravan stretched along the highway for nearly a mile, not merchants bearing goods to market, but a slave train bound for the quarries of Mordor. Hundreds of men, women, and children shuffled along in chains, their faces gaunt with hunger and their spirits broken by months or years of captivity. "How many?" asked Captain Valandil, riding up beside him. "Too many to count," Isildur replied grimly. "And the guards?" He raised his spyglass and studied the armed escort that rode alongside the prisoners. "Sothrons mostly, but I can see at least a dozen orcs among them. And there, at the head of the column, is that what I think it is?" Valandil took the glass and looked where Isildur was pointing. A figure in black armor rode at the front of the caravan, and even at this distance, the wrongness of it was palpable. No natural shadow fell behind it, and the very air seemed to writhe with darkness where it passed. "Nazgul," Valandil breathed, "the second we've encountered since Umbar." "And this one is not guarding a fortress," Isildur observed. "It's shepherding slaves, which means the others are probably scattered across the southern approaches, doing the same thing. Sauron is stripping the countryside bare, gathering every able-bodied person he can find to serve as labor in his war preparations." The sight filled him with a cold rage that was becoming disturbingly familiar. This was what happened when good people did nothing while evil spread unchecked. This was the price of Númenor's long isolation and inward focus. "Signal the companies," he said, his voice hard as iron. "We attack at dawn, and this time we take no prisoners among the slavers." The liberation of the slave caravan was swift and brutal. The Númenorian cavalry struck just after sunrise, when the guards were still half asleep, and the Nazgul was at its weakest in the growing light. The orcs fell quickly to Númenorian steel, and most of the Sothron guards threw down their weapons rather than face the legendary warriors of the Sea Kings. But the Nazgul proved more dangerous than expected. As the battle raged around it, the creature began to work some dark sorcery, raising its arms and speaking words in the black speech that made the very stones beneath their feet crack and bleed. The freed slaves nearest to it began to scream and claw at their own faces, and several of the younger Númenorian soldiers turned and fled in mindless terror. It was Elendil who ended the creature's power, appearing out of nowhere with his sword blazing like a star. The ancient blade cut through the Nazgul's spellwork as if it were cobwebs, and the creature itself dissolved once again into mist and shadow, banished but not destroyed. "You're becoming quite accomplished at that," Isildur said, as his father sheathed his weapon. "Practice," Elendil replied dryly. "More practice than I would have preferred." The aftermath of the battle revealed the true scope of Sauron's activities in the south. Among the freed slaves were people from dozens of different communities. Farmers from the river valleys, craftsmen from the coastal cities, even nobles from the smaller kingdoms who had tried to resist the growing darkness. All of them told the same story. Raids in the night, whole populations rounded up and marched north toward Mordor. Those who resisted killed without mercy. "They are not just building an army," reported one of the freed captains, a weathered man named Dagorlad, who had once commanded the guard of a small border fortress. "They are building something else. Great works of stone and iron that require thousands of laborers. And the workers who are sent to these projects, they do not return." The intelligence was disturbing, but it also provided an opportunity. If Sauron was concentrating his efforts on these massive construction projects, it meant his mobile forces were spread thin across a vast territory. A fast-moving army that could liberate the slave caravans and disrupt the supply lines might seriously damage the Dark Lord's preparations for war. "Send word to Gil-galad," Ar-Pharazôn ordered, when the reports reached him at his field headquarters. "Tell him we have found Sauron's weakness, and we intend to exploit it." The meeting between the High King of the Elves and the King of Númenor took place on neutral ground, a hilltop overlooking the ruins of Osgiliath, where the Anduin split around the island that had once held the greatest city of Gondor's ancestors. Gil-galad came with a small escort of his greatest knights, their armor gleaming silver in the afternoon sun, their banners bearing the stars and trees of ancient lineages. Ar-Pharazôn rode to meet him with an equally modest company. But where the elven procession moved with the timeless grace of their kind, the Númenorian party had the purpose and urgency of mortals who knew their time was limited. The two kings studied each other for a long moment before either spoke. Gil-galad was tall even by elven standards, his dark hair bound with a simple circlet of mithril, his grey eyes holding depths that spoke of ages beyond mortal memory. Ar-Pharazôn was broader and more powerfully built, his face bearing the lines that came with hard decisions and harder consequences, his blue eyes steady with hard-won wisdom. "You have changed, King of the Sea," Gil-galad said at last, and his voice carried no judgment, only observation. "I have learned," Ar-Pharazôn replied, "learned the cost of pride, the value of counsel, and the difference between ruling and serving. I hope that has made me a better ally than I would have been before." "The reports of your actions in the south suggest it has," the Elf King agreed. "Your forces show discipline and mercy in equal measure. Your tactics preserve innocent life, even at the cost of tactical advantage. Your soldiers fight not for conquest, but for protection." He paused, his ageless features thoughtful. "This is not the Númenor we expected to see." "It is the Númenor we should always have been," Elendil interjected, speaking from his position at Ar-Pharazôn's right hand. "The Númenor our ancestors would have recognized." Gil-galad turned his attention to the Lord of Undunia, and something like approval flickered in his ancient eyes. "You have guided your king well, Elendil of the Faithful. The wisdom of your counsel shows in every choice his armies have made." "The king chose his own path," Elendil replied diplomatically. "I merely helped him see the way forward." The formal ceremonies were completed swiftly, the signing of treaties, the exchange of tokens, the ritual words that bound the two kingdoms in alliance against the common enemy. But the real business took place afterward, when the kings and their advisors spread maps across a field table and began to plan the war that would determine the fate of Middle-earth. Sauron's forces are concentrated here, here, and here, Gil-galad said, marking positions on the map with a silver stylus. The main strength of Mordor remains within the Black Land itself, but he has significant garrisons at Minas Ithil, Durthang, and the passes of Cirith Ungol and Cirith Gorgor. Our scouts estimate perhaps 30,000 orcs and twice that number of corrupted men. Formidable numbers, Ar-Pharazôn acknowledged, but not insurmountable. What of his special servants? The 9 are scattered across his territory, each one commanding a different sector. You have already encountered 2 of them. The others— Gil-galad's expression grew grim. The others are more dangerous. The Witch King of Angmar commands the forces at Minas Ithil. He is the oldest and most powerful of the Nazgûl, and his fortress is nearly impregnable. Nearly, Isildur repeated, leaning forward over the map. But not entirely. What do you have in mind? His father asked. The young warrior traced a route on the map with his finger. Here, the old smuggler's road that runs through the Morgul Pass. It's treacherous and narrow, but a small force could use it to approach the fortress from the rear, while the main army attacks from the front. If we could take the tower and hold it long enough to signal the fleet. The fleet? Gil-galad looked puzzled. Númenorian warships can sail up the Anduin as far as the Morgul Brook, Ar-Pharazôn explained. If we held the tower and could signal their approach, they could bombard the fortress from the river while we attacked from land. But it would require perfect timing and considerable luck. Gil-galad studied the map for a long moment, his finger tracing the various approaches to the stronghold. It could work, he said finally, but the cost would be high. Many would die in such an assault. Many are dying already, Anarion pointed out quietly. Every day we delay means more slaves marched to Mordor, more communities destroyed, more innocents sacrificed to fuel Sauron's war machine. The Elf King looked at the younger son of Elendil with new interest. You speak with passion, young one, but passion alone does not win wars. No, Anarion agreed, but neither does caution when it becomes paralysis. Sauron grows stronger with each passing day. If we are to stop him, we must act while we still can. The debate continued until well past sunset, with arguments ranging from grand strategy to tactical details. But gradually, a consensus emerged. The last alliance would advance on multiple fronts, Gil-galad's forces moving through Ithilien toward the Black Gate, while Ar-Pharazôn's army struck at Minas Ithil from the south. If both attacks succeeded, they would have Sauron trapped between them, cut off from his supply lines, and forced to fight on 2 fronts. Then it is decided, Gil-galad said, as the stars came out overhead. We march at first light. The siege of Minas Ithil began 3 days later, and from the first moment, it was clear that this would be no ordinary battle. The fortress sat on a high crag overlooking the Morgul Pass, its white walls twisted into strange shapes by decades of corruption under Nazgûl rule. What had once been the Tower of the Rising Moon, a beacon of hope in the borderlands between Gondor and Mordor, was now a nightmare of black stone and writhing shadows. But it was what they found in the tower's highest chamber that truly shook the attackers. Elendil and Gil-galad had fought their way up the spiral staircase together, their combined forces driving the orc garrison before them like leaves before a storm. The Witch King himself had fled, rather than face both warriors at once, dissolving into mist and shadow as his brethren had done. But in his haste to escape, he had left behind something of immense value. A palantir, Gil-galad breathed, staring at the seeing stone that sat upon a pedestal in the center of the chamber. The ancient artifact was dark now, its surface reflecting nothing, but the very air around it seemed to pulse with malevolent power. "Corrupted," Elendil said, his sword still drawn and ready despite the absence of visible enemies. "Sauron has been using it to spy on his enemies." "More than that," came a voice from the doorway. Ar-Pharazôn entered the chamber with his personal guard, his face grim with understanding. "He has been using it to spy on Númenor. This explains how he knew so much about our preparations, our movements, our intentions. Every time we used our own Palantir to coordinate with our forces, he was watching." The implications were staggering. For years, perhaps decades, Sauron had been privy to Númenor's most secret counsels. He had known about the great armaments construction, about the corruption spreading through the island, about the king's growing doubts and fears. No wonder he had been so confident in his plans, so certain that Númenor would destroy itself through its own pride and ambition. "Can it be cleansed?" Gil-galad asked. "Perhaps," Elendil replied, studying the stone with eyes that had seen much lore in his long life. "But it would require great power and great risk. The corruption runs deep, and attempting to purify it might simply destroy the stone entirely." "Then we destroy it," Ar-Pharazôn said firmly. "Better that than leave it for Sauron to reclaim." But as they prepared to shatter the Palantir, Anarion spoke up from where he had been examining the base of the pedestal. "Wait," he said urgently. "Look at this. There are markings here, carved into the stone. They're not in the Black Speech. They're in Quenya, Elvish writing from before Sauron's corruption." Gil-galad moved closer, his eyes widening as he read the ancient script. "It's a warning," he said slowly. "A message left by whoever placed the Palantir here originally. It says that the stone has been prepared for cleansing, that when the time came, it could be purified by those with the authority to do so." "The authority?" Ar-Pharazôn asked. "The rightful king of Gondor," Gil-galad translated, "the heir of Isildur and Anarion, the descendant of the faithful who remained true to the light." All eyes turned to Isildur, who stood frozen in the doorway. The implications were staggering. If the prophecy was true, if the Palantir could indeed be cleansed, then the Alliance would have a powerful weapon to use against Sauron, a way to turn his own surveillance network against him. I don't know if I'm ready for this," Isildur said quietly. "The responsibility. None of us are ever ready for the responsibilities that fate places upon us," his father replied gently. "But that doesn't mean we can refuse them." The cleansing ritual took place at dawn, with Gil-galad and Elendil lending their power to Isildur's efforts. For a terrifying moment, it seemed as though the corruption was too strong, as though the darkness that had claimed the stone would consume them all. But then, just as hope began to fade, the Palantir blazed with silver light, and the shadow fell away like a discarded cloak. When the light faded, the seeing stone was clear and bright once more, its surface reflecting the morning sky above them, and in its depths they could see the truth that Sauron had tried so hard to hide, the real scope of his preparations, the locations of his armies, and most importantly, the growing fear in the Dark Lord's heart as he realized that his greatest victory had become his most devastating defeat. Númenor had returned, and this time it came not as a conqueror, but as a liberator. The tide of the war was turning, and even Sauron himself was beginning to understand that his long-awaited triumph might have become the instrument of his ultimate downfall. "Now we know what he knows," Ar-Pharazôn said, staring into the depths of the cleansed stone. "And more importantly, He knows that we know. The element of surprise is ours now." Gil-galad smiled, the first truly hopeful expression he had worn since the alliance began. "Then let us use it wisely. The road to Mordor lies open before us, and for the first time in long years, I believe we might actually reach the end of it." Outside, the horns were sounding to the advance. The last alliance was moving toward its final confrontation with the shadow, and this time, the light was winning. Chapter 7. The Siege of Barad-dûr. The sight of Barad-dûr rising from the heart of Mordor was enough to make even the bravest warrior question the wisdom of their enterprise. The Dark Tower stood 500 feet above the plain of Gorgoroth, its black walls seeming to drink in the light of the sun and give back only shadow. At its peak, the eye of Sauron burned like a malevolent star, turning slowly as it searched the surrounding wasteland for signs of his enemy's approach. Around the tower's base, the fortress city of Lugbors sprawled like a vast spider's web, its countless buildings and workshops shrouded in smoke from 1,000 forges. Gil-galad stood beside Ar-Pharazôn on the ridge that overlooked the Gorgoroth plain, his ancient eyes taking in every detail of their target. Neither king spoke for a long moment, each lost in contemplation of the magnitude of what they were attempting. "In all the long years since the world was young," Gil-galad said at last, "no army has ever besieged this place. Sauron built it to be impregnable, the ultimate fortress, proof against any assault that mortal or immortal minds could devise." "Then we will have to devise something unprecedented," Ar-Pharazôn replied. Behind him, the combined armies of the last alliance stretched across the horizon like a sea of banners and steel. Númenorian ships' crews worked alongside Elvish engineers, moving massive siege engines into position, while dwarf smiths sharpened weapons and repaired armor. We did not come this far to be turned back by stone walls, no matter how high or thick they might be. The plan they had conceived was audacious to the point of madness. While Gil-galad's forces established the main siege lines around the tower, Ar-Pharazôn's engineers would execute a feat of logistics that had never before been attempted. They would transport an entire fleet of warships overland to the Sea of Númenor, establishing a naval blockade that would cut off Sauron's supply lines from the south. "The ships are ready," reported Admiral Siriaten, approaching the two kings with mud on his boots and satisfaction in his voice. 20 vessels, stripped down to their essential components and loaded onto the siege carts. It will take us a week to reach the inland sea, another week to reassemble them, but once they're afloat, Sauron will be trapped," Ar-Pharazôn finished. "No supplies from Harad, no reinforcements from the east, no escape route if his position becomes untenable." Gil-galad nodded approvingly. "The dwarves have completed their siege tunnels as well. They can undermine the outer walls whenever we give the signal. But the timing must be perfect. If we move too soon, Sauron will have time to counter our strategies. Too late, and our forces will be worn down by attrition." "Then we move at dawn," Ar-Pharazôn decided. "Signal all companies. Tomorrow, we find out whether the Dark Tower can be brought down by mortal hands." The siege began with the thunder of 1,000 catapults. The great engines that the Alliance had built were marvels of engineering, some designed by Númenorian naval architects, others crafted by Elvish artisans, still others forged in the deep halls of Khazad-dûm. They hurled stones the size of houses at the walls of Barad-dûr, each impact sending tremors through the ground that could be felt miles away. But Sauron's defenses were not merely stone and mortar. As the bombardment commenced, dark sorcery answered iron and wood. Shadows reached out from the tower's walls to pluck siege stones from the air and hurl them back at their sources. Fires burned without fuel along the battlements, and things that were not quite orc and not quite man appeared on the walls to rain arrows, and worse things down upon the attackers. "The outer defences are stronger than we anticipated," reported Captain Valandel, riding back from the front lines with his armour blackened by unnatural fire. "Our engines are causing damage, but not enough. And the cost—" He gestured toward the field hospitals that had already begun to fill with wounded. "We're taking heavy casualties for every yard we advance." Isildur looked up from the map where he had been plotting the assault routes. His face was grim but determined. "Then we need to try something different. What about the eastern approach? The ground there is rougher, but it might give us cover from their artillery." "Too narrow," his father replied. "We'd be channeled into a killing ground with no room to maneuver. No, if we're going to break through, it has to be here, at the main gate." "Or underneath it," said a new voice. They turned to see Durin's son, the dwarf lord who commanded the tunneling operations. His beard was white with stone dust, and his eyes gleamed with professional satisfaction. "The main foundation stone," he continued, producing a rough sketch from his leather pouch. "We've undermined it from 3 different angles. If we can get close enough to place the charges—" "How close?" Ar-Pharazôn asked. 20 yards from the base of the tower, maybe less, but it would have to be a small team, no more than 12 men. And they'd have to move fast, because once Sauron realizes what we're doing, he'll throw everything he has at us," Elendil finished grimly, "including the 9. The plan that emerged from their council was desperate, but not impossible. A small strike force would advance under cover of the main assault, fighting their way through the outer defences to reach the base of the tower. Meanwhile, the bulk of the Alliance forces would concentrate their attack on the eastern and western approaches, dividing Sauron's attention and preventing him from overwhelming the infiltrators. "I'll lead the strike team," Isildur volunteered immediately. "No," Elendil said firmly. "You're too valuable to risk on such a mission." "With respect, father, I'm exactly valuable enough to risk on such a mission," Isildur replied. "This is what we came here to do. This is what all of our preparation and sacrifice has been leading toward. If we succeed, we break Sauron's power forever. If we fail, at least we'll have tried." Ar-Pharazôn studied the young warrior for a long moment, seeing in his face the same determination that had driven his own decision to turn away from Sauron's lies. "Very well," he said at last, "but you don't go alone. I'll lead the diversionary assault myself. If Sauron wants to stop your team, he'll have to go through me first." The assault on the Dark Tower began at midnight, when the fires of Mount Doom cast dancing shadows across the plain of Gorgoroth. Gil-galad led the eastern attack, his silver banner bright even in the hellish gloom, as he drove his forces against the outer walls of the fortress. The elves fought with the grace and skill of 3 ages, their swords weaving patterns of light through the darkness as they cut down orc after orc. But for every enemy that fell, 2 more seemed to take its place, and the advance slowed to a crawl as they fought for every step. The western assault, led by the dwarf lords of Khazad-dûm, fared little better. The stout warriors of the mountain realm were masters of siege warfare. But even their expertise was tested by the supernatural defences that Sauron had woven into his fortress. Tunnels collapsed without warning. Siege engines burst into flame at the touch of shadow, and the very stones of the walls seemed to fight back against their picks and hammers. But it was the main assault, spearheaded by Ar-Pharazôn himself, that drew Sauron's full attention. The King of Númenor rode at the front of his personal guard, his sword blazing with the light of the valor as he carved a path through the massed ranks of orcs and trolls. Behind him came the flower of Númenorian chivalry, Lords and knights who had proven their worth in a dozen battles, sailors who had learned to fight on land without losing their sea-born courage, common soldiers who had volunteered for the most dangerous mission in the history of their people. They advanced through a storm of arrows and spears, their shields locked together in formations that had been perfected over centuries of warfare. When a troll charged their line, 20 spears pierced its hide in perfect unison. When orc archers tried to break their advance, Númenorian crossbowmen answered with volleys that could punch through plate armor at 100 yards. But it was when the Nazgûl appeared that the real battle began. They came swooping down from the heights of Barad-dûr like living nightmares, their fell beasts blotting out the stars as they dove toward the Alliance forces. The Witch King led them, his crown glowing with malevolent fire as he sought out the greatest threats among his enemies. He found one in Ar-Pharazôn. The duel that followed would be remembered in song and story for as long as men drew breath. King and Wraith circled each other on the blood-soaked plain before the Dark Tower, their weapons trailing fire and shadow as they fought with all the skill and fury that immortal hatred could inspire. The Witch King was the most powerful of the nine, strengthened by centuries of service to his dark master. His blade could cut through steel as if it were parchment, his mere presence could drive lesser men mad with fear, and his knowledge of the dark arts was exceeded only by Sauron himself. But Ar-Pharazôn was no lesser man. He was the last king of Númenor in its glory, heir to a tradition of kingship that stretched back to the elder days. His sword had been blessed by the light of Valinor, his armor forged by the greatest smiths of his people, and his heart burned with the fire of redemption. He had walked through the valley of corruption and emerged purified. He had looked into the abyss of his own pride and chosen humility instead. The battle raged across the plain, neither combatant able to gain a decisive advantage. The Witch King's blade wove patterns of darkness that should have overwhelmed any mortal defender, but Ar-Pharazôn's sword answered shadow with light, turning aside every killing blow. When the Nazgûl called upon the powers of fear and despair, the king countered with the strength that came from knowing he fought for something greater than himself. In the end, it was not superior skill that won the day, but superior purpose. As the Witch King pressed his attack, seeking to overwhelm his opponent with the fury of his assault, Ar-Pharazôn stepped inside his guard and spoke a single word, not in Adunaic or Westron, but in Quenya, the high speech of the elves that had been forbidden in Númenor for so long. The word was Gil, and it meant star, not the distant lights that shone in the night sky, but the living flame that burned in the heart of every being who chose light over darkness, hope over despair, love over fear. The effect was instantaneous. The Witch King's blade shattered like glass, his crown cracked and fell from his brow, and his form wavered like smoke in the wind, with a shriek that shattered stone and sent orcs fleeing in terror. The greatest of the Nazgûl dissolved into mist and shadow, banished once again to whatever realm of darkness had spawned him. While Ar-Pharazôn fought his desperate duel above, Isildur and his strike team were making their way through the chaos of the siege toward their objective. The young warrior led his dozen companions through the maze of fallen stones and burning wreckage that surrounded the base of the Dark Tower, following the route that dwarf scouts had marked earlier. Every step was contested. Orcs appeared from hidden tunnels to attack them. Fell beasts swooped down from above to rake them with poisoned claws, and the very ground beneath their feet seemed to shift and writhe with malevolent life. But they pressed on, driven by the knowledge that the fate of Middle-earth hung in the balance. There! Anarion pointed toward a crack in the tower's foundation that the dwarf engineers had identified as the key structural weakness. If we can place the charges there and bring down that section of wall, The whole tower might collapse, Isildur finished, or at least be damaged enough that Sauron's power is broken. They fought their way to the base of the wall, hacking through a final group of orc defenders who had been positioned to guard the approach. The charges, barrels of dwarf-made explosive that burned hotter than dragon fire, were heavy and awkward. But the men of Númenor had trained for this moment. Working with desperate efficiency, they positioned the barrels in the crack and lit the long fuses that would give them just enough time to reach safety. As they retreated, Isildur looked back at the dark tower looming above them and felt a moment of doubt. Could mortal weapons really bring down something that Sauron himself had built? Could the work of hands and hearts triumph over the power of the shadow? The explosion that followed gave him his answer. The charges detonated in a chain of fire that lit up the entire plain of Gorgoroth, each barrel adding its strength to the next, until the very foundations of Barad-dûr shook like leaves in a storm. Cracks appeared in the mighty walls, spreading upward like lightning until they reached the pinnacle of the tower itself. For a moment that seemed to last forever, the dark tower swayed like a tree in a hurricane. Then, with a roar that could be heard in Gondor, an entire section of the eastern wall collapsed, taking with it 3 of the tower's defensive levels and opening a breach wide enough for an army to march through. From the highest pinnacle of the tower, the eye of Sauron turned its malevolent gaze upon the tiny figures below, and for the first time in an age of the world, there was fear in that burning orb. The siege of Barad-dûr had begun in earnest, and the Dark Lord himself was beginning to understand that his greatest fortress might not be as impregnable as he had believed. In the aftermath of the explosion, something unexpected happened within the ranks of Mordor's defenders. The orcs, who had fought with desperate savagery while their master's tower stood inviolate, began to look around with new eyes. The Easterlings who had marched from Rhûn in service to the Shadow started to whisper among themselves in their own languages, speaking words like retreat and surrender that had not been heard in Mordor for centuries. Even the trolls, bred for mindless obedience, seemed confused and uncertain, swinging their massive clubs at empty air as if fighting invisible enemies. "The spell is breaking," Gil-galad observed, watching the chaos spread through Sauron's forces from his command post on the ridge. "Without the tower's full power to bind them, his creatures are remembering what they once were." "Some of them, at least," Elendil agreed, "but not all. Look there. The Nazgûl are rallying what forces they can. This battle is far from over." Indeed, even as confusion spread through the lower ranks of Mordor's army, the remaining servants of the Shadow were regrouping around their dark masters. The Nazgûl still flew, though their power seemed diminished by the damage to their master's stronghold. The orc captains still held their units together through fear and brutal discipline, and from within the damaged tower itself, new horrors were beginning to emerge. Creatures of shadow and flame that had been hidden in Sauron's deepest dungeons. The siege would continue, but now the Alliance had something they had not possessed before. Hope. Real, tangible hope that their impossible mission might actually succeed. As the first light of dawn began to touch the peaks of the Efelduth, Ar-Pharazôn stood before the breach that Isildur's team had torn in the dark tower, and raised his sword toward the eye that glared down at them from above. "Sauron!" he called, his voice carrying across the battlefield with the authority of his royal blood. "Your fortress is breached, your servants doubt you, and your power wanes with every passing hour. Come down and face us if you dare. Come down and end this war as it began, with a choice between light and darkness." The answer that came from the tower was not words, but a roar of fury that shook the very foundations of the earth. But Ar-Pharazôn smiled as he heard it, because he recognized the sound for what it truly was. It was the roar of a creature that knew, for the first time in long years, what it meant to be afraid. Chapter 8. The One Ring's Gambit. The ground beneath Barad-dûr trembled as something stirred in the deepest foundations of the tower. The eye at its peak, which had blazed with malevolent fury throughout the siege, suddenly went dark. For a moment that stretched like an eternity, an unnatural silence fell over the battlefield. No clash of weapons, no cries of pain or rage. Even the ever-present rumble of Mount Doom seemed to fade to nothing. Then the gates of the Dark Tower opened, and Sauron himself stepped forth. He had not walked the earth in physical form for over 1,500 years, not since Gil-galad and Elendil had last stood against him in this very place. But desperation had driven him to take shape once more, and the form he wore was terrible beyond description. Tall as a mountain giant he stood, clad in armor that seemed forged from the darkness between the stars. In his hand he bore a mace that blazed with black fire, and upon his finger, the ring, Gil-galad breathed, his ancient eyes fixed on the golden band that encircled the Dark Lord's hand. He wears the One Ring openly. His power will be magnified beyond measure, but so too will be his vulnerability. If the ring can be taken, then he can be defeated, Ar-Pharazôn finished, his own gaze never leaving the approaching figure. But who among us has the strength to face him when he wields his full power? The answer came not in words, but in action. Gil-galad and Elendil stepped forward together, their weapons gleaming with the light of ages past. The High King of the Elves bore Aeglos, the spear that had been blessed by the Valar themselves, while the Lord of the Faithful carried his ancient sword, newly reforged in the fires of Númenor's redemption. But this time they would not stand alone. For Númenor, Ar-Pharazôn said quietly, drawing his own blade as he moved to join them. For Middle-earth, for all that we hold dear. The three greatest lords of the West advanced across the broken plain toward the Dark Lord, and the final battle of the Second Age began. The fight that followed dwarfed every conflict that had come before it. Sauron's mace swept through the air with the force of a falling star, each blow capable of shattering stone or splitting the earth. Where it struck, black flames erupted, consuming everything they touched, and leaving behind only ash and corruption. The Dark Lord himself seemed to grow larger with each passing moment, fed by the power of the ring until he towered over his opponents like a colossus of shadow and malice. But the three lords of the Alliance were not ordinary mortals facing an impossible foe. Gil-galad moved with the grace and skill of 3 ages, his spear weaving patterns of light through the darkness as he struck at Sauron's defenses. Each thrust of Aeglos found its mark, piercing the Dark Lord's armor and drawing forth ichor that burned like acid where it touched the ground. Elendil fought with the fury of a man who had seen his homeland corrupted and his people enslaved, his sword carving runes of fire through the air as he pressed his attack. The blade that had been blessed in the halls of the faithful blazed with silver light, and where it touched Sauron's armor, the metal cracked and blackened. And Ar-Pharazôn fought like a king reborn. Gone was the proud tyrant who had once threatened to assault Valinor itself. Gone was the corrupted ruler who had listened to the whispers of the enemy and called them wisdom. In his place stood a warrior king who had walked through the fire of his own sins and emerged purified, who had learned the difference between strength and power, between ruling and serving. His sword moved with a purpose that went beyond mere skill. Every cut was precise, every parry perfectly timed, every advance calculated to support his companions rather than glorify himself. He fought not for personal glory, but for the salvation of all free peoples, and that selfless purpose gave him strength that no amount of pride could have provided. The three moved together like a single organism, each anticipating the other's actions, each covering the weaknesses that their companions could not address alone. When Gil-galad's spear was turned aside by Sauron's superior reach, Elendil's sword was there to exploit the opening. When the Dark Lord's mace descended toward Elendil's head, Ar-Pharazôn's blade intercepted it with perfect timing. But even their combined might was barely enough to hold their own against the power of the One Ring. Sauron fought with the accumulated malice of ages, his every movement calculated to corrupt as well as destroy. Where his mace struck the ground, foul vapors rose that clouded the mind and weakened the will. His very presence was a weight of darkness pressing down upon his enemies, seeking to break their spirits before their bodies fell. "You cannot defeat me," the Dark Lord said, his voice like the sound of grinding stone. "I am the master of this world, the rightful lord of all that lives and breathes. Your resistance is meaningless, your sacrifice futile." "Perhaps," Ar-Pharazôn replied, dodging a blow that would have taken his head from his shoulders. "But we resist nonetheless. That is what it means to be free." The battle raged across the plain of Gorgoroth, the combatants moving with inhuman speed as they struck and parried, advanced and retreated. Around them, the two armies watched in awe and terror, understanding that the fate of all Middle-earth hung in the balance of this single conflict. It was Gil-galad who struck the first telling blow. The High King of the Elves found an opening in Sauron's defenses and drove his spear deep into the Dark Lord's side, piercing the armor that had turned aside a dozen lesser strikes. Sauron roared in pain and fury, but his counterattack was slowed by the wound, and Elendil was able to land a cut across the Dark Lord's sword arm that sent black ichor spraying across the battlefield. But the ring's power was not so easily overcome. Even wounded, Sauron fought on with desperate fury, his mace weaving patterns of destruction that forced his opponents back. And worse, the corrupting influence of the One Ring was beginning to take its toll on the three lords. Gil-galad's movements became slightly erratic as whispers of power filled his mind. Visions of a world restored to elven rule, of the darkness driven back forever, of immortal kingdoms that would never fade or fail. All he had to do was claim the ring for himself, to use Sauron's own weapon against him. Elendil's sword arm trembled as the ring showed him images of Númenor restored, of his people freed from their exile and returned to their island home. The power was there for the taking, power enough to undo every tragedy, to heal every wound, to right every wrong that had been done. But it was Ar-Pharazôn who faced the greatest temptation of all. The ring whispered to him of dominion over all the world, of a throne that would make the crown of Númenor seem like a child's toy. It showed him visions of armies bowing before his banner, of cities built to his glory, of the valor themselves acknowledging his supremacy. All the pride and ambition that he had struggled to overcome came flooding back, magnified 1,000-fold by the ring's malevolent influence. "Take me," it seemed to whisper. "Take me, and claim what is rightfully yours. You were born to rule, born to command. Why should you serve when you could be master? For a moment, just a moment." Ar-Pharazôn wavered. The old hunger stirred in his heart, the familiar voices of pride and ambition that had nearly destroyed his kingdom and his soul. It would be so easy to give in, to let the darkness claim him as it had claimed so many others. But then he remembered another voice, speaking words that had saved him from his own folly. Some doors should never be opened. Some paths lead only to darkness, no matter how bright they appear at the beginning. His grandfather's wisdom, preserved across the years and the generations, finally found its mark. Ar-Pharazôn's eyes cleared, his grip on his sword steadied, and he struck out at Sauron with renewed purpose. "No," he said simply. "I have walked that path before, and I know where it leads." The three lords pressed their attack with desperate fury, knowing that their strength was waning while Sauron's seemed inexhaustible. Gil-galad's spear flashed like lightning, Elendil's sword carved runes of power through the air, and Ar-Pharazôn's blade sought every gap in the Dark Lord's defenses. And then, in a moment that would be remembered for all the ages to come, Gil-galad and Elendil struck together. The High King's spear punched through Sauron's breastplate, piercing the heart that beat with borrowed life, while Elendil's sword swept down to sever the hand that bore the One Ring. The Dark Lord's scream of agony shattered stone and sent his own armies fleeing in terror. But even as his physical form began to collapse, his malevolent will reached out toward the golden band that had fallen to the ground. "The ring?" Gil-galad gasped, his strength fading as the effort of striking down a Maya took its toll. "Someone must take it, destroy it." "I will," said a voice from behind them. They turned to see Isildur running toward them across the battlefield, his face set with grim determination. The young warrior had seen the entire battle from his position with the main army, had watched as his father and the other lords fought for the very soul of Middle-earth. Now, as victory hung in the balance, he would not hesitate to do what needed to be done. He snatched up the ring from where it had fallen, feeling its power course through him like molten fire. For an instant, the temptation was almost overwhelming. The ring showed him visions of himself as a great king, ruler of both Gondor and Arnor, commander of armies that could sweep away all evil forever. But Isildur had learned something that his canonical counterpart never would. He had learned what happened when good men seized power with the intention of using it for good. He had seen his own king walk to the very brink of destruction because he believed that might make right, that good intentions justified any means. The ring promised power, but Isildur had grown up in a world that had learned to distrust power above all else. "No," he said, echoing the words his king had spoken moments before. "This belongs in the fire." Without hesitation, he turned toward Mount Doom and began to run. The journey to the Sammath Naur took longer than any distance Isildur had ever traveled, though in truth it was less than a mile from the battlefield to the entrance of the Crack of Doom. Behind him, he could hear the sounds of pursuit, orcs and fell beasts loyal to their master even beyond death, Nazgûl shrieking their fury as they realized what he intended to do. But ahead of him, he could also hear the sound of hoofbeats. Númenorian cavalry, led by his brother Anarion, had seen his desperate run and were moving to intercept his pursuers. The sound of battle erupted behind him as the two forces clashed, but Isildur did not look back. His father's son, he kept his eyes fixed on the goal ahead. The ring grew heavier with each step, its weight pressing down upon him like a mountain. It whispered constantly now, showing him visions of power and glory, reminding him of every slight he had ever suffered, every wrong that had ever been done to him or his people. It promised revenge, domination, the power to set all things right according to his will. But louder than the ring's whispers were the voices of those who had shaped him. His father's wisdom, his king's hard-won humility, the lessons learned through Númenor's redemption. He had seen what corruption looked like, had helped tear down the temples, where good men had been twisted into servants of evil. He would not let that happen to himself or to anyone else. The entrance to the Sammath Naur loomed before him, a cave mouth that glowed with the fire of the earth's heart. The heat was overwhelming, the air thick with sulphur and ash, but Isildur pressed on. At the very edge of the precipice that overlooked the molten lava below, he stopped. One more step, and it would be over. One more step, and the power that had corrupted kings and destroyed kingdoms would be unmade forever. The ring made one last desperate attempt to save itself, showing Isildur a vision of Middle-earth restored to perfect peace, with himself as its wise and benevolent ruler. But the young warrior had spent too many months watching his king struggle with the consequences of power, had seen too clearly what happened when even good men tried to impose their will upon the world. "I am not wise enough to use you," he said to the ring. "No one is." He opened his hand, and the one ring fell into the fires from which it had been forged. The destruction was immediate and absolute. The ring's golden surface cracked and melted as it struck the lava, and with its destruction, the last of Sauron's power was broken forever. Across the plain of Gorgoroth, the Dark Lord's physical form crumbled to ash and was scattered by the wind. The Tower of Barad-dûr swayed and collapsed, with a roar that could be heard across all of Middle-earth, its black stones tumbling into the chasm that opened beneath it. And in the Sammath Naur, Isildur smiled as he watched the fires consume the instrument of so much evil. "It is finished," he said. The celebration that followed the destruction of the ring was unlike anything that had ever been seen in Middle-earth. Representatives of every free people gathered on the plain before the ruins of Barad-dûr. Men of Númenor and Gondor, elves of Lindon and Rivendell, dwarves of Khazad-dûm and the Blue Mountains, even Ents from Fangorn, who had come to witness the end of the shadow that had poisoned so much of their world. But the joy was tempered by the terrible cost of victory. Gil-galad had fallen in the moment of triumph, his strength finally exhausted by the effort of striking down a Maiar. The High King of the Elves lay in state beneath the banners of his people, his face peaceful in death, his hands clasped around the spear that had helped save the world. Elendil lived, but barely. The Lord of the Faithful would bear the scars of his battle with Sauron for the rest of his days, and though he had survived, those who loved him could see that something essential had been burned out of him in that final confrontation. Of the three lords who had faced Sauron in single combat, only Ar-Pharazôn emerged unscathed. But as he stood before the assembled armies and looked out over the faces of those who had followed him to victory, the King of Númenor felt no triumph, only a deep and abiding sadness for all that had been lost. "We have won," he said, his voice carrying across the plain to every ear. "The shadow is broken, the ring is destroyed, and Sauron will trouble Middle-earth no more. But victory has come at a price that we must never forget. Good people have died so that others might live free. Kingdoms have been shattered so that the world might be made whole. Heroes have sacrificed themselves so that their children might know peace." He paused, his eyes finding Isildur in the crowd. The young man who had destroyed the ring stood beside his wounded father, his face bearing an expression of profound relief mixed with exhaustion. "The question now," Ar-Pharazôn continued, "is what we do with the world that they have given us. Do we use our victory wisely, or do we repeat the mistakes of the past? Do we learn from our failures, or do we forget them in our moment of triumph?" The answer to those questions would shape everything that came after. But for now, as the sun set behind the mountains of shadow and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, it was enough that the choices could be made at all. The ring was destroyed, Sauron was defeated, and the long night of the Second Age had finally come to an end. The Third Age would begin with hope. Chapter 9. The Crown of Reunited Kingdoms. The great council convened in the ruins of Osgiliath, where the Anduin split around the ancient island that had once held the greatest city of the Dúnedain's ancestors. They had chosen the location deliberately, not in the halls of any existing power, but in a place that belonged to no single people, where all voices could be heard as equals. Representatives had come from every corner of Middle-earth that had been touched by the war. Númenorian nobles sat beside dwarf lords from the Blue Mountains. Elven princes shared tables with freed slaves from the south, and merchants from the liberated cities of Harad debated policy with shepherds from the hill country of Rovanio. At the center of it all sat Ar-Pharazôn, but the man who occupied the simple wooden chair bore little resemblance to the proud king who had once commanded the greatest fleet in the history of the world. His crown lay on the table before him, not worn, but present as a reminder of the authority that had made this gathering possible. His clothes were practical rather than ceremonial, and his manner was that of a participant in the discussion rather than its master. "The question before us," he said, his voice carrying easily through the great tent that had been erected to shelter the assembly, "is not whether we have the right to rule the lands that we have liberated. It is whether we have the wisdom to govern them well." Lord Durin, speaking for the dwarves, was the first to respond. "In Khazad-dûm, we have always chosen our kings by the will of the people and the approval of the fathers. No one rules who has not proven himself worthy, and no rule endures that does not serve the common good." "Easy enough to say when you're talking about a single mountain realm," countered Captain Thorondor, one of the Númenorian officers who had distinguished himself during the siege. "But we're discussing an empire that stretches from the Grey Havens to the Sea of Rune. How do you govern such a vastness without central authority?" "Perhaps," said a new voice, "the question is not how to govern such a vastness, but whether such a vastness should be governed at all." All heads turned toward Isildur, who had spoken from his place among the younger delegates. The destroyer of the ring had been quiet for most of the proceedings, listening rather than speaking, but when he did offer his thoughts, they carried weight that his age alone could not have granted. "What do you mean?" Ar-Pharazôn asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. Isildur rose from his seat, moving to the great map that had been spread across the central table. "Look at this," he said, his finger tracing the borders of the former empire of Mordor. "Sauron tried to rule everything from a single point, Barad-dûr. Everything flowed toward the center, everything was controlled from above. And what was the result? Tyranny, corruption, and ultimately collapse." He looked around the assembly, meeting the eyes of representatives from a dozen different peoples. "We have a choice. We can replace Sauron's tyranny with a different kind of tyranny, more benevolent perhaps, but still rule imposed from without rather than governance chosen from within. Or we can try something different, something that has never been attempted on this scale before." "Which is?" prompted Lady Inselbeth, leaning forward with interest. "A confederation," Anarion said, rising to stand beside his brother. "Not an empire with a single ruler, but an alliance of free peoples, each governing themselves according to their own customs and needs, but bound together by common cause and mutual aid." The idea hung in the air like an unspoken challenge. It went against everything that the assembled nobles had been taught about governance, everything that their ancestors had believed about the nature of kingship and authority. "It would never work," said one of the Gondorian lords. "Without a central authority, without someone with the power to enforce decisions and settle disputes, the whole structure would collapse into chaos within a generation." "Perhaps," Elendil said quietly, speaking for the first time since the session had begun. The Lord of the Faithful was still weak from his wounds, but his voice carried the authority of someone who had looked into the heart of darkness and chosen to walk toward the light. But what if it did work? What if we could build something that served the people instead of ruling them? What if we could create a form of government that grew stronger through diversity rather than weaker through division? The debates that followed lasted for weeks. Some argued for a restoration of the old kingdoms, Gondor and Arnor, reunited under a single crown, with tributary states paying homage to a central throne. Others proposed a system of regional governors, appointed by a supreme council and answerable to a central authority. But gradually, as the discussions continued and the representatives began to understand each other better, a different model began to emerge. The turning point came when Ar-Pharazôn made an announcement that shocked even his closest advisors. "I renounce my claim to the crown of Númenor," he said, standing before the assembled representatives with his royal circlet in his hands. "Not because I believe myself unworthy to wear it, but because I believe the office itself to be unworthy of what we are trying to build here." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the sounds from outside the tent, the bustle of the camp, the distant ring of hammers as the ruins of Osgiliath were slowly rebuilt, seemed to fade to nothing. "My lord," Lady Inselbeth said carefully, "surely you don't mean to abandon your people?" "I mean to serve them better than I ever could as their absolute ruler," Ar-Pharazôn replied. "I have learned, these past months, that true leadership comes not from commanding obedience, but from inspiring cooperation. Not from imposing your will upon others, but from helping others find the best expression of their own will." He set the crown on the table, pushing it toward the center where everyone could see it. "Let Númenor be governed by a council of its wisest citizens, chosen by the people themselves and answerable to them alone. Let the crown become a symbol not of royal authority, but of collective responsibility. And let this decision serve as an example to all the peoples of Middle-earth, that power exists to serve those who grant it, not the other way around." The impact of this decision rippled through the assembly like shock waves. If the King of Númenor, the mightiest ruler in Middle-earth, was willing to give up absolute power in favor of shared governance, what did that mean for all the other forms of authority that had seemed so fixed and permanent? "You're talking about revolution," said one of the elven lords, but his tone was thoughtful rather than condemnatory. "A complete restructuring of how civilized peoples organize themselves." "I'm talking about evolution," Ar-Pharazôn corrected gently. "A natural progression from what we have learned through hard experience. We tried rule by the wise, and we got corruption. We tried rule by the strong, and we got tyranny. Perhaps it is time to try rule by the willing." The system that eventually emerged from their deliberations was unlike anything that had ever existed in Middle-earth. The Confederation of Free Peoples, as it came to be known, was not a single nation, but a voluntary alliance of independent realms. Each member people, whether Númenorian or Elvish, Dwarvish or Mannish, the freed slaves of the south or the wild men of the northern forests, retained complete autonomy over their internal affairs. But for matters that affected the common good, trade disputes, threats to mutual security, great works that required coordination across multiple realms, they would send representatives to a grand council that would meet annually in the rebuilt city of Osgiliath. The council would have no permanent ruler, no hereditary nobility, no central authority that could impose its will upon unwilling subjects. Instead, it would operate by consensus, with each people's representatives carrying equal weight regardless of their realm's size or power. "It will be messy," Anarion warned as they worked out the final details. slow, inefficient, full of compromises that satisfy no one completely. "Good," his brother replied. "Efficient governments are usually tyrannical governments. If our system is slow and messy and argumentative, it means that people are actually participating in it instead of just submitting to it." The restoration of Gondor and Arnor proceeded along similar lines. Rather than reuniting the two kingdoms under a single crown, Elendil's sons would rule them as separate but allied realms, bound together by family ties and common purpose, but free to develop according to their own needs and traditions. Isildur took the crown of Gondor, with his capital at the newly rebuilt city of Minas Anor, while Anarion established himself in the northern kingdom of Arnor, ruling from the ancient fortress of Númenor. Both swore oaths, not just to their own people, but to the broader principles of the Confederation, that power should serve rather than rule, that authority should be earned rather than inherited, that the needs of the many should outweigh the desires of the few. But perhaps the most remarkable changes came in the lands that had been under Sauron's direct control. Mordor itself, once the byword for desolation and evil, was slowly being transformed. The poisoned earth was cleansed through techniques developed by elven naturalists working alongside dwarvish miners and Númenorian scholars. The slave camps were dismantled and replaced with voluntary settlements where former captives could choose their own destinies. Most surprising of all, many of those who had served the Shadow, orcs and corrupted men alike, were given the chance to redeem themselves through honest labor and peaceful contribution to the common good. Not all took the opportunity, and those who remained irredeemably evil were dealt with accordingly, but enough chose the path of redemption that entirely new communities began to spring up in the shadow of Mount Doom. "It seems impossible," mused Lord Círdan as he walked through one of these experimental settlements with Ar-Pharazôn. The Elf Lord had become one of the strongest supporters of the new system, despite, or perhaps because of, his great age and long experience with more traditional forms of government. Former enemies working side by side, building rather than destroying. "Everything worthwhile seems impossible until someone does it," Ar-Pharazôn replied, watching as a mixed crew of men, elves and reformed orcs worked together to raise the walls of a new community center. "The question is not whether it can be done, but whether we have the courage to keep doing it when it gets difficult." The cultural changes that accompanied the political revolution were even more dramatic. Intermarriage between different peoples, once rare and often discouraged, became commonplace as the barriers between communities began to break down. Númenorian merchants took dwarf wives and learned the secrets of underground agriculture. Elven craftsmen shared their techniques with human apprentices who brought their own innovations to ancient arts. New cities arose that were designed from the beginning to accommodate multiple peoples and traditions. Pelagia, rebuilt at the mouth of the Anduin, became a marvel of cooperative architecture, its harbors designed by Númenorian naval engineers, its foundations laid by dwarvish stonemasons, its gardens planned by elven naturalists, and its governance entrusted to a council drawn from all its diverse inhabitants. The changes were not without their challenges. There were those among every people who resisted the new order, who preferred the certainties of the old hierarchies to the uncertainties of shared power. Conflicts arose, disputes erupted, and more than once it seemed as though the entire experiment might collapse under the weight of its own ambitions. But each time crisis threatened, the leaders of the Confederation found ways to address the problems without resorting to the authoritarian solutions that their ancestors might have chosen. Mediation replaced conquest, negotiation replaced intimidation, and compromise replaced the simple imposition of superior force. "We are writing a new chapter in the history of Middle-earth," Isildur told the first session of the Grand Council, as representatives from 30 different peoples gathered in the great hall of Osgiliath. Not with swords and sorcery, but with patience and wisdom and the simple recognition that all of us, regardless of our origins, share the same fundamental desires: to live in peace, to raise our children in safety, to contribute something meaningful to the world we share. He paused, looking out over the assembly that included former enemies sitting as equals, former slaves debating policy with former masters, representatives of peoples who had been at war for centuries, now working together to build something unprecedented. "The age of kings and empires is ending," he continued. "The age of the common good has begun. Let us make sure that we prove worthy of the opportunity that victory has given us." The applause that followed was not the wild cheering of subjects acknowledging their sovereign, but something quieter and more lasting, the sound of free people choosing their own path forward. Outside, the sun was setting over the restored city of Osgiliath, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. But for the first time in living memory, the approaching night held no terror. The darkness had been driven back not just by force of arms, but by the simple power of people choosing to trust each other rather than fear each other. The work of building this new world would take generations. There would be setbacks and failures, moments of doubt and despair. But the foundation had been laid, not in stone or steel, but in the recognition that power shared was not power diminished, but power multiplied. The crown of reunited kingdoms had become something far greater than any crown. It had become the dream of a better world, shared by all who chose to claim it. Chapter 10. The Age of Wisdom. 5 years after the fall of Barad-dûr, the Great Road was completed. It stretched from the Grey Havens in the west to the Iron Hills in the east, a marvel of cooperative engineering that connected every major settlement in Middle-earth. Where once merchants had struggled through wilderness paths and brigand-haunted passes, now wide stone highways carried trade caravans in safety and comfort. Bridges spanning mighty rivers bore the marks of dwarvish masonry and Númenorian engineering working in harmony, while rest stations built to accommodate travelers of every race dotted the route at regular intervals. Isildur stood at the dedication ceremony for the final section, watching as representatives from 30 different peoples gathered to celebrate what many were already calling the greatest achievement of the new age. The young king of Gondor, though he had long since stopped thinking of himself as a traditional king, felt a deep satisfaction as he looked out over the crowd. 10 years ago, he said, his voice carrying clearly in the crisp morning air, armies marched these same paths, carrying weapons of war. Today, we dedicate roads that will carry the tools of peace, knowledge and crafts, friendship and trade, the 1,000 small connections that bind free peoples together in common cause. The response was not the formal applause of a royal ceremony, but something warmer and more genuine, the cheers of people who had worked together to build something magnificent, and who knew that they would all share in its benefits. Among the crowd, Isildur's eye caught sight of a group of young people who had helped with the final construction. They were an impossible sight by the standards of the old world. Elven maidens working alongside dwarf lads, Númenorian nobles sharing tools with former slaves from Horad, children of every race playing together, while their parents discussed the technical details of roadway maintenance. This was the first generation to grow up entirely within the Confederation, and they were unlike anything Middle-earth had ever seen before. The great library of Umbar had taken 3 years to build, and already it was being called the wonder of the age. The massive structure rose from the center of the rebuilt city, like a mountain of white marble and crystal, its towers reaching toward the sky, while its foundations delved deep into the earth. But its true magnificence lay not in its architecture, impressive though that was, but in its contents. Every scrap of knowledge from every people of Middle-earth was being gathered here, copied by teams of scribes working in shifts around the clock, translated into multiple languages, and made available to any scholar who wished to study them. Elven lore that had been hoarded in hidden libraries for millennia now sat beside dwarvish technical manuals and Númenorian charts of the distant seas. The medical knowledge of the Southrons was being combined with the herbalist traditions of the Rohirrim, while the astronomical observations of the Eastern peoples were cross-referenced with the star maps of Lindon. Anarion walked through the main reading hall, marveling at the sight of scholars from a dozen different cultures working side by side. At one table, an elven master of ancient languages collaborated with a young Númenorian linguist to decipher texts that predated the rise of men. At another, a dwarf engineer discussed mining techniques with a former orc who had proven remarkably adept at understanding underground tunnel systems. "It's magnificent," said a voice beside him. Anarion turned to see Círdan approaching, the ancient elf lord moving with the careful grace of someone who had lived through the rise and fall of ages. But there was something different about him now, a lightness that had not been there during the war years, as if some great burden had been lifted from his shoulders. "More than magnificent," Anarion replied. "It's revolutionary. For the first time in the history of Middle-earth, knowledge is being shared freely between all peoples, instead of being hoarded by the few." "Indeed," Círdan agreed, his eyes wandering over the busy scholars. "And perhaps that is why we have chosen to remain." The comment required no elaboration. Everyone knew that the elves had been preparing for their departure to Valinor for centuries, driven by a weariness that came from watching the world change while they remained unchanging. But something extraordinary had happened in the years since the Confederation's founding. The slow fade had stopped. Not just stopped, reversed. Elven settlements that had been dwindling were growing again. Young elves who had been born weary with the world's sorrows were discovering joy in the new age of cooperation and shared purpose. Ancient lords who had been preparing for the grey ships were choosing instead to put down new roots in the transformed Middle-earth. "The world grows brighter rather than dimmer," Círdan explained, seeing Anarion's questioning look. "For the first time in long ages, we see hope for the future rather than merely nostalgia for the past. Why would we leave when there is so much yet to be built?" The trading networks that had grown up around the Great Road were transforming Middle-earth in ways that went far beyond simple commerce. Goods that had once been rare luxuries were becoming commonplace as efficient transportation and peaceful relations opened up new markets. Mithril from Khazad-dûm was being worked by Númenorian smiths into jewelry that was then traded to the Southrons for spices that found their way to elven kitchens in Rivendell. Dwarf-forged tools were increasing agricultural yields across the continent, while elven textiles were bringing beauty into the lives of common folk who had never before been able to afford such luxuries. But perhaps more importantly, the trade routes were carrying ideas as well as goods. Númenorian shipbuilding techniques were being adapted by the coastal peoples of Farharad, while their innovations in deep-water fishing were being shared with the corsairs who had once been their enemies. Dwarvish mining methods were transforming the economies of the hill countries, and elven agricultural wisdom was turning former wastelands into gardens. Lady Inzilbeth, now serving as Númenor's representative to the Confederation's Trade Council, reviewed the quarterly reports with satisfaction. Prosperity was spreading to corners of Middle-earth that had never known it before, and with prosperity came stability, education, and hope for the future. "The numbers are remarkable," she reported to the latest session of the Grand Council. "Trade volume has increased by over 300% since the Confederation's founding. Average lifespans are up in every member territory. Literacy rates are climbing. Infant mortality is declining. And for the first time in living memory, families can be reasonably certain that their children will live better lives than they have." But the most remarkable changes were not captured in any statistics. In the markets of Pelagia, elven musicians performed alongside dwarvish drummers and Southron singers, creating new forms of music that drew from traditions that had been separate for millennia. In the workshops of Minas Anor, craftsmen of different races worked together to develop techniques that none of them could have discovered alone. And throughout the lands of the Confederation, something that had once been unthinkable was becoming commonplace. Marriages between peoples who had traditionally been enemies or strangers. The first such wedding had been between a Númenorian ship captain and an elven lady of Lindon, celebrated with ceremonies that blended the traditions of both peoples. But it was far from the last. Dwarf miners were marrying Gondorian farmers, elven scholars were wedding Rohirrim horse lords, and the children of these unions were growing up truly bilingual, truly bicultural, bridges between worlds that had been separate since the earliest days. It was in the 6th Yor after Sauron's defeat that Ar-Pharazôn announced his intention to sail west to Valinor. The news sent shockwaves through the Confederation. Though the former king had officially renounced his crown, he remained one of the most respected voices in Middle-earth. His wisdom had guided the formation of the new government. His example had inspired the peaceful transition from monarchy to confederation, and his presence had been a source of stability during the challenging early years. "Why now?" Isildur asked, as they sat together in the gardens of Minas Anor, watching his young children play with their friends, a mixed group that would have been impossible under the old order. "Everything is going so well. The Confederation is prospering. The member peoples are working together, better than anyone dared hope. Why leave now?" Ar-Pharazôn was quiet for a long moment, his eyes distant as he watched the children at their games. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of hard-won wisdom. "Because it is time," he said simply. "I have learned what I came to learn, done what I was meant to do. The world no longer needs the king of Númenor. It has grown beyond the need for kings at all. What it needs now are leaders who were born into this new age, who understand cooperation rather than conquest as their natural state. But the Valar, will they welcome you? After everything that happened, after the threats you made against Valinor itself?" Ar-Pharazôn smiled, and it was the smile of a man who had found peace with himself and his choices. "I don't know," he admitted. "Perhaps they will welcome the king who learned humility. Perhaps they will reject the man who once threatened their realm. But I must try. Not because I believe I deserve forgiveness, but because I believe in the possibility of redemption for all of us, even for those who have fallen furthest from the light." The ship that carried Ar-Pharazôn west was built in the old style, not the massive warships that had once comprised his great armament, but a simple vessel suitable for a single passenger and his small retinue. It bore no weapons, flew no banners, save a simple white pennant that spoke of peace and humility. The entire population of Romena turned out to see him off, but the ceremony was quiet, almost private. This was not a royal departure, but something more personal, a man setting out on a journey of the spirit rather than the flesh. As the ship disappeared beyond the western horizon, those who watched from the harbour spoke in whispers of what might await him. Some believed he would be welcomed with open arms, his transformation serving as proof that even the most corrupted souls could find their way back to the light. Others feared he would be turned away, his past sins too great to be forgiven, even by the merciful Vala. But 3 months later, the answer came in a form that no one had expected. The ship returned, but it was no longer the simple vessel that had departed. Instead, it gleamed like captured starlight, its sails shone like polished silver, and its wake was filled with light that danced like living jewels. And standing at its prow was our Pharazôn, not as he had been when he left, but transformed, his mortal flesh made radiant by some blessing beyond the comprehension of earthbound minds. "I bring word from the undying lands," he said, as he stepped onto the dock where thousands had gathered to witness his return. "The Valar have spoken, and their message is one of hope for all the free peoples of Middle-earth." The blessing he carried was not just for himself, but for all who had chosen the path of cooperation over conquest, wisdom over power. The Valar had looked upon the Confederation and found it good, not perfect, but striving toward something worthy. And as a sign of their approval, they offered their protection and guidance to all who would accept it. But more than that, they offered something that had been unthinkable since the change of the world, the possibility of visitors traveling between Middle-earth and Valinor, of knowledge and wisdom flowing both ways across the sundering seas. The Age of Wisdom had begun in earnest, and even the undying lands themselves were taking note. In the workshops of Austin Edil, new discoveries were being made daily. Elven craftsmen working with dwarvish engineers and Númenorian scholars had developed techniques that surpassed anything achieved by their ancestors. Alloys stronger than steel but lighter than copper, glasses that could focus starlight itself, and tools that could shape stone as easily as clay. But the greatest discoveries were in the realm of healing. The medical traditions of every people were being combined and refined, creating treatments for diseases that had plagued Middle-earth since the beginning of the world. Elven understanding of the body's spiritual nature was being merged with dwarvish knowledge of anatomy and Númenorian expertise in surgery, while the herbalist traditions of the wild men were providing new insights into the healing properties of plants. Children who would once have died of fever were being saved by medicines that drew from a dozen different traditions. Warriors who would have been crippled by their wounds were walking again, thanks to treatments that no single people could have developed alone. "We are becoming something new," observed one of the master healers as he reviewed the latest treatment protocols with his colleagues. Not elves or men or dwarves working separately, but all of us working together, creating knowledge that none of us could achieve alone. It was a sentiment that was being echoed throughout the Confederation. In every field of endeavor, from agriculture to astronomy, from architecture to artistry, the cooperation between different peoples was producing innovations that exceeded the sum of their parts. The first generation, born into this age of cooperation, was coming of age, and they were remarkable in ways that their parents could barely comprehend. Fluent in multiple languages, comfortable with multiple cultures, trained in traditions that spanned the known world, they were becoming living bridges between peoples who had been strangers for millennia. Some traditionalists worried that these young people were losing touch with their ancestral identities, that the price of cooperation was the erosion of what made each people unique. But the children themselves seemed to have found a different path, one that honored their heritage while embracing the larger world that had opened up before them. "I am Númenorian," explained one young woman when asked about her identity. "But I am also a daughter of the Confederation, a citizen of Middle-earth, a friend to all free peoples. These are not contradictions. They are the full expression of what it means to be truly free. As the 10th anniversary of Sauron's defeat approached, delegations from every member people were gathering in Osgiliath to celebrate what was being called the Decade of Wisdom. But the real celebration was not in any ceremony or speech. It was in the simple fact that children across Middle-earth were growing up in a world where cooperation was stronger than conflict, where wisdom was valued more than power, where the greatest achievement was not to conquer others but to lift them up. The Age of Wisdom was not just a historical period. It was a way of life, a commitment to the belief that all free peoples could build something together that none of them could achieve alone. And as the children of that age looked toward the future, they saw not the slow decline that their grandparents had feared, but endless possibilities for growth, discovery, and joy. The light was growing brighter, and there was no end in sight. Chapter 11. The Shadow of Eternity. 40 years after the fall of Sauron, the Grand Council faced a crisis that none of its founders had anticipated, the crisis of success itself. The session hall in Osgiliath was more crowded than it had ever been, representatives from nearly 60 different communities, now holding seats in what had once been a gathering of 30 peoples. The prosperity of the Confederation had attracted new settlements, new alliances, new voices that demanded to be heard in the governance of Middle-earth. But with those new voices came new tensions, new disagreements about the direction that their unprecedented experiment in cooperation should take. The population of Pelargia has tripled in the past decade, reported Councillor Adiriel, a young elf who had been born into the Age of Wisdom and who spoke for the newer settlements along the Anduin. Housing is scarce, the harbour is overcrowded, and the sewage systems that were adequate for a city of 30,000 are failing under the strain of nearly 100,000 residents. Murmurs rippled through the assembly. Overpopulation had once been an unthinkable problem. For most of recorded history, the great cities of Middle-earth had been struggling to maintain their numbers against war, disease, and the slow entropy of the ages. Now they faced the opposite challenge: too much growth, too much prosperity, too much success. The same problems plague Minas Anor, added Councillor Boromir, a descendant of one of the Gondorian lords who had fought in the War of the Last Alliance. We've expanded the city 3 times, and still people come seeking work, seeking opportunity, seeking the prosperity that our cooperation has created. But the infrastructure can't keep pace. Isildur, now greying at the temples, but still vital in his middle years, studied the reports that had been flooding in from across the Confederation. Food shortages in the cities, despite record harvests in the countryside. Overcrowded roads that had been built for the traffic of decades past. Pollution in the rivers as workshops and forges multiplied to meet ever-growing demand. Perhaps, he said carefully, we need to consider whether growth for its own sake is truly beneficial, whether bigger is always better. The comment sparked an immediate response from the younger delegates. With respect, Lord Isildur, said Councillor Veantur, a Númenorian woman barely 30 years old who represented the merchant guilds. That sounds like the voice of someone who has already achieved everything he wanted. Those of us who represent the newer settlements, the growing communities, the people who are still building their lives, we cannot accept limits imposed by those who are already comfortable. The tension in the hall was palpable. It was the first time in the Confederation's history that such a direct challenge had been made to one of the founding leaders, and everyone present understood the significance of the moment. I am not suggesting limits, Isildur replied, his voice carefully controlled. I am suggesting wisdom. There is a difference between growth that serves the common good and growth that serves only itself. "And who decides what serves the common good?" demanded Councillor Aldemir, speaking for the hill settlements of eastern Gondor. "Who has the right to tell a free people that they have grown enough, prospered enough, achieved enough?" The debate that followed would later be remembered as the Great Schism, not because the Confederation fell apart, but because it revealed fundamental disagreements about the nature of progress that had been hidden beneath the surface of their unprecedented success. The philosophical dimensions of the crisis became clear during a late-night session held in the more intimate setting of the council chambers, with only the senior delegates present. "We have created something remarkable," acknowledged Círdan, now the eldest voice in the assembly since Elendil's peaceful death 3 years earlier. "A civilization where death by violence is rare, where hunger is almost unknown, where children can expect to live longer and healthier lives than their parents. But in doing so, we have raised questions that no society in the history of Middle-earth has ever had to face." Anarion leaned forward, his face troubled. "What do you mean?" "What is the purpose of mortality?" the ancient elf asked, "in an age where mortal life has been extended almost indefinitely? What is the meaning of struggle when struggle has been largely eliminated? What drives people to achieve greatness when comfort and security are guaranteed?" The questions hung in the air like a challenge. For 40 years, the Confederation had focused on solving the problems of scarcity, conflict, and suffering. Now they were discovering that success brought its own complications. "We see it in the newer settlements," observed Lady Indis, who had taken over much of her late mother's work in social policy. "Young people who have never known want, never faced real hardship, never had to fight for anything important. They are not lazy or selfish, but they lack purpose, direction, the driving force that shaped their parents' generation. And so they create artificial challenges," added Councillor Telumendil, a scholar who had been studying the social changes across the Confederation. "Elaborate games, pointless competitions, philosophical movements that seem designed more to create drama than to solve real problems. They are seeking meaning in a world that has perhaps become too comfortable." Isildur nodded grimly. He had seen it in his own children. Bright, talented young people who had never wanted for anything, who had been given every advantage that his generation's sacrifices could provide, but who seemed somehow restless, unfulfilled, searching for something that their elders could not quite identify. "Perhaps," he said slowly, "we have been so focused on eliminating suffering that we have forgotten why struggle exists in the first place. Not as a punishment, but as a source of growth, of purpose, of meaning." "You're suggesting we should create artificial hardships?" Anarion asked, skeptical. "I'm suggesting we should think carefully about what we want this civilization to become," Isildur replied. "Do we want to create a world where everyone is comfortable and safe and ultimately bored? Or do we want to find new forms of challenge that give life meaning without causing genuine harm?" The discovery of Sauron's hidden contingency plans came at the worst possible time, when the Confederation was already struggling with internal tensions and philosophical divisions. The reports arrived from the Far East, carried by merchants who had been exploring trade routes beyond the traditional boundaries of Middle-earth. In the distant lands of Rhûn and Khand, they had found evidence of Sauron's influence that had survived his destruction. Not direct servants or magical artifacts, but something more subtle and potentially more dangerous. "Corruption that propagates itself," reported Master Palando, one of the blue wizards who had investigated the findings personally. "Sauron embedded certain ideas into the governing structures of these distant peoples. Ways of thinking about power, about authority, about the relationship between ruler and ruled that continue to spread even without any conscious direction. The implications were disturbing. While the Confederation had been focused on building their cooperative utopia, Sauron's intellectual poison had been slowly spreading through cultures that had never been directly liberated, never been offered an alternative to authoritarian rule. Kingdoms are arising in the East that follow patterns we thought we had eliminated forever, Pallando continued. Absolute rulers who claim divine right to command their subjects. Military castes that exist solely to enforce the will of the powerful. Economic systems designed to concentrate wealth and resources in the hands of the few while keeping the many in poverty and ignorance. How far has this spread? Asked Anarion. We don't know. But if current trends continue, we could be facing a new Dark Lord within a generation or two. Not a supernatural threat like Sauron, but something potentially worse. A human tyrant who has learned from Sauron's mistakes and who commands the loyalty of peoples who have never known freedom. The news sent shock waves through the Confederation. For 40 years, they had assumed that Sauron's defeat meant the end of the threat he represented. Now they were learning that ideas could be more dangerous than armies, that corruption could spread through cultural contact as easily as through military conquest. We have to do something, declared Councillor Veantur. We cannot stand by and watch tyranny take root in lands we could have protected. Do what, exactly? Challenged Councillor Aldemir. March across half the world to impose our values on peoples who never asked for our help? How is that different from what Sauron tried to do? Because our values promote freedom instead of slavery, Veantur shot back. Because we seek to liberate rather than conquer. And who decided that our definition of liberation is the correct one? Aldemir replied. Who gave us the right to determine how other peoples should live? The debate that followed would rage for months, dividing the Confederation along lines that had never existed before. Some argued for active intervention, military expeditions to overthrow the emerging tyrants, missionary efforts to spread the ideals of cooperative governance, economic pressure to force changes in distant lands. Others insisted on strict neutrality, that the Confederation had no right to interfere in the affairs of sovereign peoples, no matter how objectionable their governments might be. The environmental challenges became impossible to ignore during the Great Drought of S.A. 3349. For 3 consecutive years, the rains had been lighter than usual. For any previous civilization in Middle-earth, this would have meant famine, plague, and the collapse of trade networks. But the Confederation's advanced agriculture, efficient transportation, and cooperative resource sharing had largely prevented direct human suffering. What they couldn't prevent was the ecological damage. The Anduin ran lower than it had in living memory. Ancient forests began to die as their root systems could no longer reach the water table. Wildlife populations crashed as their traditional habitats became uninhabitable. And most alarming of all, the careful balance between different regions that had allowed the Confederation's prosperity began to break down. We have been too successful, admitted Master Radagast during an emergency session of the Environmental Council. Our agricultural techniques have allowed us to support populations far beyond what the land can naturally sustain. Our industrial methods have provided prosperity at the cost of the very systems that make life possible. The wizard gestured toward a map that showed the extent of the ecological damage, rivers polluted by runoff from expanded workshops, forests cleared to make room for new settlements, mines that had been dug deeper and wider to meet the ever-growing demand for raw materials. For 40 years we have treated Middle-earth as if it were a machine that existed solely to serve our needs, he continued. We have forgotten that we are part of a living system, not its masters. The implications were staggering. Everything the Confederation had built, the cities, the trade networks, the prosperous communities, depended on an ecological foundation that was beginning to crack under the strain of their success. "What are our options?" asked Isildur, his face grave, as he contemplated the possibility that their greatest achievement might also be their greatest failure. "Fundamental changes in how we live," Radagast replied bluntly. "Smaller populations, less industrial production, simpler lifestyles, a return to the kind of existence our ancestors knew, when human impact on the environment was limited by human weakness. That would mean abandoning everything we've built," protested Councillor Boromir, "telling millions of people that they must accept poverty and hardship so that the trees can have more water." "The alternative," Radagast said quietly, "may be telling them that they must accept death and starvation because we waited too long to change our ways." The great question emerged from these converging crises, like a lightning bolt from a storm cloud. What was the ultimate purpose of the Confederation? What were they trying to achieve, and how would they know if they had achieved it? The debate took place not in the formal sessions of the Grand Council, but in countless smaller conversations, in taverns and workshops, in homes and markets, in the private correspondence between leaders and the public speeches of ambitious politicians. Some argued that the goal should be the transformation of Middle-earth itself into something resembling the Undying Lands, a realm where death and decay were conquered entirely, where every inhabitant could live in perfect peace and prosperity for as long as they chose. The means existed, they claimed: elven wisdom, Númenorian technology, dwarvish craftsmanship, all combined and refined until they could reshape the very nature of the world. Others insisted that such a goal was not only impossible but undesirable. Mortality, they argued, was what gave life meaning. Struggle was what promoted growth. The imperfection of the world was what made it worth fighting to improve. To eliminate these things would be to create not paradise, but a kind of living death. "We stand at a crossroads," declared Master Elrond during one of the most influential speeches of the era. "We can attempt to become like the Valar, immortal, unchanging, perfect in our wisdom and our power. Or we can choose to remain mortal, accepting all the limitations and pain that mortality brings, but also accepting its gifts. The urgency that comes from knowing our time is limited. The passion that comes from knowing our choices matter. The hope that comes from knowing that each generation can build something better than the last." The choice, he argued, was not just about policy or governance. It was about the fundamental nature of what it meant to be alive in Middle-earth. As the debates raged on, it became clear that the Confederation faced its greatest challenge yet, not from external enemies or natural disasters, but from the simple question of what they wanted to become. The Age of Wisdom had solved the problems of scarcity and conflict, but in doing so, it had revealed deeper questions about purpose, meaning, and the ultimate destiny of the free peoples of Middle-earth. The answers they chose would determine not just the fate of their generation, but the shape of the world for ages to come. And for the first time since Sauron's defeat, nobody was certain what the right choice might be. Chapter 12. The music continues. Ar-Pharazôn died as the sun was setting on the longest day of the year, 73 years after he had chosen humility over pride and changed the fate of all Middle-earth. He passed peacefully in his sleep, surrounded by those who had become his chosen family in the years since he had renounced his crown. Not the courtiers and nobles who had once competed for his attention, but the scholars and craftsmen, farmers and teachers, former enemies turned friends who had found in the old king a wisdom that transcended the accidents of birth and breeding. Isildur was there, now an old man himself, but still vital, still carrying the authority that came from having destroyed the One Ring and helped shape the world that followed. Anarion sat beside his brother, his hair white as snow, but his eyes still bright with the intelligence that had made him one of the Confederation's most trusted counselors. Around them gathered representatives from every people of Middle-earth, elves and dwarves, men of every nation, even some of the redeemed who had once served the shadow, but had found their way to the light. "He changed everything," whispered Lady Muriel, now in her 90s, but still sharp of mind and strong of purpose. She had been one of the last survivors of Númenor's dark years, one of the few who could remember what life had been like before the Confederation, before the Age of Wisdom, before the moment when a proud king had chosen to step back from the brink of disaster. "He changed himself first," Isildur replied quietly. "That was the key to everything else. He could not have saved others if he had not been willing to save himself from his own pride." They kept vigil through the night, sharing stories of the man who had been king and servant, conqueror and penitent, destroyer and creator. As dawn broke over the hills surrounding the simple house where Ar-Pharazôn had chosen to spend his final years, word spread across Middle-earth that an age had ended. But it was not an ending that brought sorrow. It was an ending that brought completion, the sense of a great work finished and ready to be handed on to those who would carry it forward. The funeral procession began at Ravenna, where Ar-Pharazôn's body lay in state in the great hall that had once housed the crown of Númenor. But the crown was not there. It had been melted down decades earlier, its gold distributed among the craftsmen who had forged rings for the marriages that bound the different peoples together, its jewels set into the cornerstones of schools and hospitals that served all without regard to race or rank. Instead, the hall was filled with symbols of what the king had truly achieved. Maps showing the trade routes that connected every corner of Middle-earth, treaties written in a dozen languages establishing peace between former enemies, architectural plans for the great works that had transformed wasteland into garden and discord into harmony. Representatives from every member of the Confederation came to pay their respects. But more than that, for the first time since the change of the world, emissaries from Valinor itself crossed the sundering seas to honor a mortal who had chosen redemption over destruction. They came quietly, without fanfare or ceremony, but their presence was unmistakable. Tall figures in robes of starlight, their faces ageless, but their eyes filled with the weight of creation itself. The Maiar had come to witness the passing of a king who had learned to serve rather than rule, who had chosen wisdom over power, and in doing so had changed the very nature of the world. "He was one of us, in the end," said the figure who had once been known as Radagast, now revealed in his true form as a guardian of the living earth. Not in blood or origin, but in purpose. He learned what we have always known, that true power lies not in commanding others, but in empowering them to command themselves. The procession wound through every major settlement in Middle-earth, taking months to complete its journey. In each city and town, the people lined the streets not as subjects mourning their sovereign, but as citizens honoring a man who had helped create the world in which they lived freely. In Pelagia, shipwrights and merchants sang songs in his honor, their voices blending the musical traditions of half a dozen different cultures into something entirely new. In Minas Anor, scholars from the great libraries carried torches that burned with flames of every color, each representing a different branch of knowledge that had flourished under the Confederation's protection. In the settlements of former Mordor, the redeemed offered prayers of gratitude for the man who had shown them that even the most corrupted souls could find their way back to the light. But it was in Osgiliath, at the heart of the Confederation, that the true significance of Ar-Pharazôn's legacy became clear. The Eternal Council convened for the first time as the funeral procession reached its destination. It was not a government in any traditional sense. There were no permanent offices to be filled, no hereditary positions to be inherited, no central authority to impose its will upon distant provinces. Instead, it was something that had never before existed in the history of Middle-earth, a truly representative body that spoke for all the free peoples and would continue to do so for as long as freedom itself endured. "We gather not to rule, but to serve," declared the first speaker, a position that would rotate among the different peoples and would never be held by the same person for more than a single year. "We gather not to command, but to coordinate. We gather not to impose our will, but to discover the will of those we represent and help them achieve it." The chamber itself was a marvel of cooperative design. Built into the living rock of the island that divided the Anduin, it seemed to grow from the earth itself rather than being imposed upon it. Its walls bore the symbols of every people who had joined the Confederation, but they were not arranged hierarchically. There was no high seat for the most powerful, no corner shadows for the least significant. Instead, they flowed together like the verses of a song, each voice distinct, but all contributing to a harmony that was greater than any individual part. The first session of the Eternal Council dealt with the questions that had been building throughout Ar-Pharazôn's final years. How should the Confederation respond to the challenges of prosperity? How could they balance growth with sustainability, freedom with responsibility, individual desires with collective needs? But as the debates unfolded, it became clear that something fundamental had changed in the way that people approached these problems. Where once there might have been factions fighting for dominance, now there were simply different perspectives seeking synthesis. Where once there might have been winners and losers, now there were only participants in a conversation that would continue for as long as civilization itself endured. "We have learned something that our ancestors never imagined," observed Eldara, one of the young leaders who represented the generation born entirely within the age of wisdom. "We have learned that the goal of governance is not to find final answers, but to keep asking better questions. Not to solve all problems forever, but to create systems that can adapt and grow as new problems emerge." The solutions that emerged from their deliberations were as innovative as they were practical. Instead of trying to control population growth, they would focus on creating new forms of community that could accommodate it. Instead of imposing environmental restrictions, they would develop technologies that worked with natural systems rather than against them. Instead of choosing between intervention and isolation in distant lands, they would offer friendship and assistance to any who asked for it, while respecting the right of all peoples to choose their own destinies. Most importantly, they established the principle that would guide all future decisions: the music continues. It was a reference to the creation myth that all the peoples of Middle-earth shared in some form, the belief that the world itself was a song being sung by Eru Ilúvatar, with each people and each individual adding their own voice to the growing harmony. The Eternal Council would not try to write the ending of that song, but would work to ensure that every voice could be heard, every melody could find its place, every harmony could be explored. The first ships to sail west from Middle-earth to Valinor as ambassadors rather than exiles departed on the anniversary of Sauron's defeat. They carried representatives from every member of the Confederation, but they were not going as supplicants or conquerors. They were going as partners, as equal participants in the ongoing conversation between the mortal and immortal realms about the future of creation itself. The sight of those ships disappearing beyond the western horizon was unlike anything that Middle-earth had ever seen. Where once the grey ships had carried the elves away from a world that was fading, now vessels of every design, Númenorian longships and elven swan boats, dwarf-built vessels that could sail both sea and river, even crude but sturdy craft built by the newer peoples who were just beginning to explore the wider world, all sailed together toward a destination that was no longer forbidden, but welcomed them openly. "They will return," said Círdan, as he watched the fleet disappear into the sunset. "And when they do, they will bring with them new knowledge, new perspectives, new possibilities for what Middle-earth can become. The age of separation is ending. The age of true cooperation, not just between the peoples of this world, but between this world and the realm beyond, is beginning." From the harbour of the Grey Havens, the transformation was already visible. The lands that had once been marked by the Shadow's touch were green again, but with a greenness that seemed to glow with its own inner light. The cities that had been rebuilt after the war showed architectural styles that blended the traditions of all peoples into something entirely new. The very air seemed cleaner, brighter, more alive than it had been in living memory. And over it all, visible to those who had learned to see with more than their physical eyes, was a light that seemed to emanate from the world itself, not imposed from without, but growing from within, as if Middle-earth was slowly becoming what it had always had the potential to be. In the years that followed Ar-Pharazôn's death, the transformation continued and deepened. The challenges identified in the great debates were addressed not through authoritarian solutions, but through innovations that emerged from the cooperative spirit that now defined Middle-earth. Overpopulation led to the development of floating cities that rode the currents of the great rivers, expanding living space without consuming more land. Resource shortages sparked discoveries of new materials and new ways of using old ones more efficiently. Environmental damage was healed through techniques that combined elven understanding of natural systems with dwarvish engineering and human innovation. Most remarkably, the very nature of death began to change. Not that mortality was eliminated. That remained the defining characteristic of men and the other mortal races. But the fear of death, the despair that it had once brought, gradually faded as people came to understand their place in the ongoing song of creation. Death became not an ending, but a transition, not a failure, but a completion, not a defeat, but a passing of responsibility to those who came after. Children grew up in a world where the greatest ambition was not to accumulate power over others, but to contribute something meaningful to the common good. Young people chose their life's work not based on what would bring them the most wealth or status, but on what would add the most beautiful notes to the ongoing melody of civilization. Artists collaborated across racial and cultural boundaries to create works that captured the spirit of the new age. Scientists shared their discoveries freely, knowing that knowledge belonged to all peoples rather than any one group. Even merchants found that their greatest profits came not from exploiting others, but from creating networks that benefited everyone involved. And through it all, the memory of Ar-Pharazôn served as a reminder of how much could change when even one person chose to step back from the brink of disaster and seek a better path forward. 1,000 years later, when bards sang the stories of the elder days and children gathered around fires to hear tales of heroes and monsters, they would speak of the moment when the fate of all creation hung in the balance. Not in the outcome of a great battle or the casting of a mighty spell, but in the simple choice of a proud king to listen to his grandfather's wisdom and turn away from the path of conquest. They would tell how that single decision had rippled outward like stones cast into a still pond, changing first the king himself, then his kingdom, then all the free peoples of Middle-earth, and finally the very nature of the world itself. They would speak of the age of kings that had ended in pride and corruption, and the age of wisdom that had grown from its ashes, an age where power served rather than ruled, where diversity strengthened rather than weakened, where the greatest victory was not the defeat of enemies, but the transformation of enemies into friends. And they would look around at the world they had inherited, a world of cities that grew like gardens, of peoples who moved freely between realms that welcomed them all, of knowledge that flowed like water to wherever it was needed most. And they would understand that they were living in a legend, participants in a story that was still being written, voices in a song that would never end. The music continues, they would say to one another, as they went about their daily work of building and creating and discovering. The music continues, and we are all part of it. And in the halls of Valinor, where the Valar kept their eternal watch over the unfolding of creation, there would be smiles as they listened to the new harmonies rising from Middle-earth, harmonies that had never been heard before, melodies that emerged from the choice to build rather than destroy, to include rather than exclude, to serve rather than dominate. For this was what Eru Ilúvatar had intended from the beginning. Not a world where good triumphed over evil through force of arms, but a world where evil itself was transformed by the patient, persistent application of wisdom and love. The moment when Ar-Pharazôn had chosen humility over pride had been just one note in the vast symphony of creation. But it had been the note that changed the key, that shifted the entire melody from minor to major, from tragedy to triumph, from ending to beginning. And the music continues still, in every choice that every person makes, to build rather than tear down, to include rather than exclude, to serve rather than dominate. Each such choice adds another note to the eternal song, another verse to the endless story, another thread to the tapestry that will never be complete because it grows more beautiful with every passing day. This is how the world changes, not through the grand gestures of heroes, but through the small choices of ordinary people who decide, one decision at a time, to make tomorrow better than today. And this is how the music continues, one voice at a time, one note at a time, one choice at a time, until all of creation sings in harmony with the original theme that was sung at the beginning of all things. The age of wisdom had no ending, because wisdom itself has no ending. It simply grows deeper, richer, more beautiful with each passing generation, each new voice that joins the song, each fresh perspective that adds its own unique melody to the eternal chorus. And in that eternal chorus, the voice of Ar-Pharazôn the humble, once Ar-Pharazôn the golden, once the proud king who nearly destroyed all he loved, would always have its place, singing the song of redemption that he had learned in the moment when he chose to listen to wisdom rather than pride. The music continues, and it is beautiful.